Bevor wir in die Geschichten Napoleons eintauchen, stelle ich euch eine Frage. War Napoleon für euch eher ein genialer Staatsmann, der Europa modernisierte, oder ein machtbesessener Eroberer, der den Kontinent in endlose Kriege stürzte? Schreibt eure Meinung unten in die Kommentare, denn genau diese Frage begleitet uns durch sein ganzes Leben. Napoleon Bonaparte gehört zu den faszinierendsten und widersprüchlichsten Figuren der Weltgeschichte. Er kam von der Insel Corsica, begann als junger Offizier in einer Zeit des Chaos und stieg in nur wenigen Jahren zum mächtigsten Mann Europas auf. Er gewann gewaltige Schlachten, krönte sich selbst zum Kaiser, veränderte Recht, Verwaltung und Politik ganzer Länder und hinterließ Spuren, die bis heute sichtbar sind. Doch sein Weg war auch geprägt von Ehrgeiz, Propaganda, Machtwillen, Verrat, Kriegen und Millionen von Menschen, die den Preis für seine Träume bezahlen mussten. Wenn ihr spannende Geschichte mögt, dann lasst gerne ein Like da und abonniert den Kanal, damit ihr keine weiteren historischen Videos verpasst. Und jetzt reisen wir zurück in eine Zeit, in der Revolutionen Königreiche erschütterten, Armeen Europa überzogen und ein einzelner Mann glaubte, das Schicksal eines ganzen Kontinents in seinen Händen zu halten. Chapter 1. The Boy of Corsica and the World Before the Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15th, 1769 in Ajaccio, Corsica, at a time when Europe was still dominated by kings, princes, old noble families, and rigid social orders. His birth took place at a moment that already reveals a lot about his later life, because Corsica had only recently come under French rule. The island had long fought for its independence, especially under the freedom leader Pasquale Paoli, who became a symbol of resistance to foreign rule for many Corsicans. Napoleon's family experienced these upheavals at close quarters. His father Carlo Bonaparte initially had sympathies for the Corsican independence movement, but after Paoli's defeat he came to terms with the new French order. This decision was decisive for the future of his family, as it opened the way for the children of the Bonaparte family to enter French schools, offices, and military careers. The family belonged to the lower nobility, but was by no means rich. She had prestige, an old name, and certain privileges, but in everyday life was marked by money worries, dependencies, and ambitious hopes. Napoleon's mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a strict, strong-willed woman who raised her children with toughness and discipline. She had experienced years of war, insecurity, and political violence, and taught her children early on that life left no room for weakness. Napoleon did not grow up in a sheltered palace, but in a family that stood between pride, limited means, and the desire for social advancement. This field of tension had a deep impact on him. He learned early on that origin was important, but not enough. If you wanted to get promoted, you had to fight, adapt, and take advantage of opportunities. Corsica itself was more than just his home for the young Napoleon. The island was rough, proud, and full of contrasts. Family ties, honor, local loyalties, and the awareness of their own Corsican identity determined the thinking of many people. For Napoleon, this meant that even as a child he stood between two worlds. On the one hand, he felt like a Corsican, shaped by the history of the island and its resistance to France. On the other hand, he was introduced to the French system by his father's decisions. This double imprint made him sensitive to rejection and ridicule, but also unusually attentive to power relations. He knew early on what it felt like to be an outsider. It was precisely this feeling that would later become a source of his ambition. When Napoleon was sent to France as a child, a difficult time began for him. He first attended a school in Autun, later the military school of Brienne. There he was far away from his family, his language, and his familiar surroundings. His French was not completely confident at first. His accent betrayed him, and his classmates from wealthier families often regarded him as foreign and provincial. Napoleon withdrew, developed pride and defiance, and sought recognition less through social agility than through achievement. He was particularly interested in mathematics, history, geography, and military issues. These subjects were important for a career in artillery, an area of the military where technical knowledge, calculation, and accuracy were crucial. Even here, a basic feature of his later thinking became apparent. For him, war was not only courage and glory, but planning, movement, logistics, and the precise use of forces. The military school shaped Napoleon in a world that was still firmly shaped by class thinking. Officers' careers were usually open to the nobility, but not every nobleman had the same opportunities. There was a world of difference between the old high nobility and the poorer provincial nobility. Napoleon felt these differences. Although he formally belonged to a privileged class, he often felt disadvantaged. This experience nurtured a deep aversion to those who were above others by birth alone, without showing achievement. At the same time, he admired order, rank, and discipline. Even in his youth, he was united by two forces that would later determine his life: the revolutionary idea that talent must be more important than origin, and the authoritarian idea that a society needs strong leadership and clear hierarchies. While Napoleon was growing up, France was in an increasingly severe crisis. At first glance, the kingdom was one of the most powerful powers in Europe. It had a large population, a significant army, cultural prestige, and a court in Versailles that stood for splendor and royal splendor. But behind this facade, the problems grew. The state was heavily indebted, among other things due to costly wars and support for the American independence movement against Great Britain. The tax system was unfair and inefficient. Many privileged people paid little or no direct taxes, while farmers, craftsmen, and citizens had to bear great burdens. Crop failures, rising bread prices, and economic uncertainty exacerbated the situation. At the same time, ideas of the Enlightenment spread that questioned reason, civil rights, legality, and political codetermination. More and more people are questioning the old order. For the young Napoleon, this changing world was of enormous importance. If he had been born only a few decades earlier, his career would probably have had narrow limits. The highest military and political positions would have been reserved for men from powerful noble families. But the crisis of the Ancien regime, i.e. the old monarchical social order, soon tore open doors that had previously been closed. Napoleon was ambitious, gifted, and disciplined, but these qualities alone would not have been enough. He also needed a time when talent could suddenly become more important than ancestry. Exactly this time was approaching. After his training, Napoleon became an artillery officer. Artillery was considered a technical weapon, less glamorous than cavalry or infantry, but it required brains, numeracy, and organizational talent. That suited him. He was not a man who wanted to rely only on physical bravery. He analyzed, compared, planned, and thought in terms of possibilities. At the same time, he read a lot, especially about great men of antiquity, about Rome, about generals, legislators, and founders of the state. This reading gave his ambition a historical dimension. Napoleon didn't just want to have a good career. Early on, he developed a sense that history could be shaped by people if they had courage, opportunity, and willpower. But at first, his future remained uncertain. The young officer was still far from being a ruler of Europe. He was a small, ambitious man from a poor noble family, with a strong accent, sensitive pride, and a great desire for recognition. He loved Corsica, but France offered him the stage. He despised some of the privileges of the old society, but himself benefited from his aristocratic status. He admired republican ideals, but at the same time he dreamed of greatness, fame, and personal power. These contradictions did not make him weaker, but more dangerous. For Napoleon was not a simple idealist, nor was he a mere adventurer. He was someone who understood the language of ideas, but also the mechanics of power. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, everything changed. The storming of the Bastille, the declaration of human and civil rights, the attack on aristocratic privileges, and the growing radicalization of politics opened a new era. For France, the revolution meant chaos, hope, violence, and new order at the same time. For Napoleon, it meant a possibility. In the old world, he might have remained a capable but limited officer. In the new world, a man like him could rise if he thought fast enough, acted decisively enough, and was willing to take risks. The revolution destroyed certainties, but it created opportunities. Napoleon recognized this earlier than many others. No one knew yet that this young Corsican would one day become emperor of the French. But the conditions that made his rise possible were now in place. A weak state, a torn society, an army in upheaval, and a time when power fell to those who seized it with determination. Chapter 2. France in Flames. The Revolution as a stage for Napoleon's rise. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon Bonaparte was not yet a famous man, a political leader, or a celebrated general. He was a young officer, ambitious, attentive, and internally torn between his Corsican origins and his career in the French service. But it was precisely this time of upheaval that was to open up a stage for him that would hardly have been conceivable in the Old World. France was in a deep crisis that had not arisen suddenly, but had built up over decades. The state was in debt, society was unequal, the monarchy was weakened, and the confidence of many people in the old order was shaken. What began as a political crisis quickly developed into a revolution that affected all areas of life and fundamentally questioned the balance of power in Europe. At the heart of this crisis was the Ancien Regime, the old order of royal rule, estates privileges, and social inequality. The nobility and clergy enjoyed rights that were denied to the majority of the population. Many farmers and citizens bore high duties and taxes, while some of the privileged classes were largely exempt from them. At the same time, a self-confident bourgeois class had emerged, which was economically important but had little political influence. Ideas of the Enlightenment spread in salons, books, and political writings. Terms such as freedom, popular sovereignty, equality before the law, and human rights were no longer only discussed by philosophers, but increasingly reached public opinion. When King Louis XVI convened the Estates General to solve the financial crisis, he inadvertently opened a door that could no longer be closed. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789 became a symbol of a new era. The Bastille was no longer particularly important militarily, but it was considered a sign of royal arbitrariness. Their capture showed that the people of Paris were willing to use violence to force political change. This was soon followed by the abolition of feudal privileges, the declaration of human and civil rights, and a complete reorganization of political thought. The king initially remained in office, but his authority was broken. France was no longer an immutable monarchy, but a country on the move. For young men like Napoleon, this meant an enormous change. A society that had previously been determined by birth, rank, and proximity to the court began to give greater weight to the claim of performance, talent, and political utility. Napoleon initially observed this development not as a great revolutionary in the center of power, but as an officer on the fringes of events. At the beginning, his attitude was strongly influenced by Corsica. He thought long and hard about the future of his home island and admired Pasquale Paoli, the old Corsican freedom leader who returned from exile after the outbreak of the revolution. For Napoleon, the revolution initially seemed to be an opportunity to give Corsica greater self-determination. France now spoke of freedom and rights, and many Corsicans hoped to derive political benefit from this. But it soon became apparent that the interests of the Corsican national movement and the goals of revolutionary France did not fit together in the long term. Napoleon came into conflict with Paoli, whose course was increasingly directed against the French Republic. This break was personally painful for Napoleon, but politically decisive. He finally freed himself from the idea that his future lay primarily in Corsica. France now became his stage. The revolution also changed the army. Many noble officers fled abroad because they rejected the revolution or feared for their lives. This created gaps in the command structures that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for men from higher social classes. For talented younger officers, opportunities for advancement suddenly opened up. Napoleon benefited from this development. Not because everything was given to him, but because circumstances favored men who combined education, ambition, and determination. Expertise was particularly in demand in artillery. Cannons had to be calculated, batteries correctly placed, ammunition organized, and movements coordinated. In an army that had to reinvent itself in the midst of revolutionary uncertainty, A capable artilleryman could attract attention more quickly than in the rigid army of the old monarchy. But the revolution was not only an opportunity, it was also a dangerous chaos. The political camps became radicalized. Monarchists, moderate revolutionaries, Jacobins, Girondins, and other groups fought for influence. The boundaries between political conviction, personal ambition, and naked struggle for survival became increasingly blurred. The king tried to escape, was brought back, later deposed and executed in January 1793. This execution shook Europe. For the monarchies of Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, and other powers, revolutionary France was now not only an unstable neighbor, but an ideological threat. If a people could overthrow and kill its king, then the old order was endangered everywhere. France was attacked from the outside and shaken internally by uprisings, mistrust, and political violence. It was in this atmosphere that the terror of the Jacobins was born. Under the pressure of war, betrayal, economic hardship, and internal uprisings, the revolution became harder and harder. The Committee of Public Welfare, Robespierre and his allies justified violence as a necessary means of saving the Republic. Thousands of people were arrested, convicted, and executed. The guillotine became the dark symbol of a revolution that also spread terror in the name of freedom. Napoleon moved cautiously in this world, but not uninvolved. He was close to the Jacobins at times, not least because they defended the Republic and gave young, talented officers chances. His political thinking was not yet fixed at that time in the sense that he would have served an abstract ideology unconditionally. Rather, he recognized which forces actually had power. He understood that political loyalty in a revolution was not only conviction, but could also mean protection, career, and access to important patrons. The siege of Toulon in 1793 was decisive for Napoleon. The city had risen up against the revolutionary government and let British and Spanish troops into the harbor. This was a serious threat to the Republic, as Toulon was an important naval base. If France's enemies gained a permanent foothold there, the Mediterranean coast could be endangered. As a young artillery officer, Napoleon was given the opportunity to show off his skills. He realized that the key to retaking the city was not an ill-considered frontal attack, but the control of certain heights and positions from which the harbor could be shelled. His artillery planning contributed significantly to forcing the enemy fleet to retreat. Toulon was recaptured, and Napoleon was promoted. An unknown officer suddenly became a man whose talent was noticed in Paris. This success was more than a military step. He showed how closely war and politics were linked in the revolution. Those who saved the Republic on the battlefield could rise politically. Those who delivered victories were needed. Napoleon understood this exactly. He realized that in times of crisis, military performance could be a form of political power. The revolution had put France in a situation in which armies not only defended borders, but ensured the survival of the new state. As a result, the successful general became one of the most important figures in the new society. Napoleon wasn't that general yet, but Toulon was the first clear indication that he could become one. After the fall of Robespierre in July 1794, it became temporarily dangerous for Napoleon. His proximity to Jacobean circles brought him under suspicion, and he was briefly arrested. But as so often in his life, his adaptability proved to be decisive. He survived the crisis, remained in the service, and waited for the next opportunity. The revolution devoured many of its own children, but it still needed men who could establish order and control violence. This was precisely where Napoleon's opportunity lay. He was not an orator at the great meetings, not a theoretician of the revolution, and not a leader of the people in the classical sense. His strength lay in thinking clearly in the midst of uncertainty, recognizing military possibilities and acting decisively. France was now exhausted, but not defeated. The Republic had pushed back its enemies, but internally it remained unstable. Economic hardship, political intrigues, uprisings, and power struggles shaped the country. Many people longed for peace, security, and order, without necessarily wanting to return to the old monarchy. It was precisely this need for order that would later carry Napoleon's political career. The revolution had destroyed the old world, but it had not yet created a lasting new order. A dangerous intermediate space arose between freedom and violence, civil rights and dictatorship, the will of the people and military power. In this intermediate space, Napoleon moved more and more confidently. Chapter 2 therefore shows the revolution as the actual birth of Napoleon's career. Without the collapse of the old order, without the flight of many nobles from the army, without the wars against Europe's monarchies, and without the Republic's need for capable officers, his rise would hardly have been conceivable. Napoleon was an extraordinarily gifted man, but his talent coincided with an extraordinary time. The revolution did not immediately give him power, but it gave him the opportunity to become visible. She turned a Corsican outsider into a French officer with a future, and it created a world in which a man who could place cannons correctly would one day try to order states, kings, and entire peoples according to his will. Chapter 3. The young officer, Toulon, talent, and first victories. At the beginning of his military career, Napoleon Bonaparte was still far from the image that posterity would later paint of him. He was not an emperor, not a lord of Europe, not a man whose name aroused fear and admiration at the same time. He was a young artillery officer, ambitious, often withdrawn, filled with great pride and at the same time dependent on the turmoil of a revolution that could destroy careers but also create them at incredible speed. It was precisely this combination of personal talent and historical state of emergency that made his rise possible. In a quiet era, Napoleon would probably have moved slowly through the military ranks, limited by origin, connections, and the rigidity of an old order. In the revolution, however, what suddenly counted was who was useful, who could act, and who found solutions in dangerous moments. Artillery was of crucial importance to Napoleon. It was not just one type of weapon among many, but a school of thought. If you wanted to use cannons effectively, you had to calculate distances, read terrain, organize supplies, concentrate firepower, and recognize the right moment. Unlike a brilliant cavalry attack, artillery was less about romantic heroism than about precision, patience, and technical superiority. It was here that Napoleon learned to view war not as a chaotic clash of brave men, but as a problem of space, time, motion, and force. This mindset would later become one of his greatest advantages. He understood early on that an army won not only through courage, but through speed, supply, coordination, and the ability to be stronger than the enemy at a crucial point. His first years of service, however, were anything but straightforward. The revolution had shaken the French army. Many noble officers had left the country, others were dismissed, persecuted, or were under mistrust. At the same time, the Republic urgently needed capable soldiers, because it was fighting against internal uprisings and external enemies. For young men like Napoleon, this opened up gaps that would have been difficult to reach in the past. But every chance was fraught with danger. Political proximity to the wrong people could be just as dangerous as military failure. Napoleon moved in a world in which loyalty, conviction, adaptation, and opportunism could hardly be separated from each other. He was ambitious enough to look for opportunities, but smart enough not to sacrifice himself unnecessarily. The decisive moment of his early career came in 1793 with the siege of Toulon. The city in the south of France was of enormous importance for the Republic. Toulon was not just any city, but one of France's most important naval bases on the Mediterranean. When royalist forces rose up against the revolutionary government and British and Spanish troops were allowed into the port, it was a heavy blow to Paris. The enemies of the revolution suddenly had access to a strategic center of the French fleet. If Toulon had been permanently lost, this would not only have dramatically worsened the military situation in the Mediterranean, but would also have severely damaged the reputation of the young republic. The reconquest therefore became a question of power, prestige, and political survival. Napoleon did not come to Toulon as a supreme commander, but as a young officer who had to prove what he could do in a difficult situation. But that was precisely his strength. He quickly realized that the city could not be regained by mere bravery or uncoordinated attacks alone. The key was in the harbor. If it was possible to threaten the enemy ships with artillery fire, the British and their allies would have to give up their position. Napoleon therefore concentrated on certain heights from which the French batteries could control the port. This consideration already showed his typical eye for the decisive point. He did not think in terms of many simultaneous goals, but looked for the center, the fall of which would shake the entire enemy system. The battles for Toulon were hard, confusing, and full of political tensions. The revolutionary troops were not always well organized, many commanders were under pressure, and the suspicion of treason was omnipresent. Napoleon had to assert himself not only against the external enemy, but also in an environment in which military decisions immediately took on political significance. Nevertheless, he managed to push through his ideas. French artillery was used effectively, important positions were taken, and finally the Allied troops found themselves in a situation they could no longer hold. When the British evacuated the port, Toulon was regained for the Republic. For Napoleon, this meant the breakthrough. After Toulon, he was promoted to brigadier general. This promotion was extraordinary for such a young man, but it corresponded to the logic of the revolution. Those who were successful were able to rise quickly. Napoleon had shown that he was not only theoretically gifted, but could act under pressure. He had proven that he could combine terrain, firepower, and strategic impact. But Toulon gave him more than a higher rank. It gave him visibility. At a time when Paris was constantly looking for men who could save the Republic, a successful officer was a political asset. Napoleon began to be noticed in the circles that decided careers. Nevertheless, his rise remained uncertain. The revolution was changeable, and those who were needed yesterday might be suspicious tomorrow. Napoleon had contacts with the Jacobins, especially with Augustin Robespierre, the brother of Maximilien Robespierre. When Robespierre was overthrown and executed in the summer of 1794, many of his former supporters were also in danger. Napoleon was arrested and had to fear that his career would end before it had really begun. But he was soon released. This episode probably showed him very clearly how dangerous political dependence could be. He learned that power in revolutionary times did not remain permanently with one party. If you wanted to survive, you had to be flexible without losing sight of your goals. In the years after Toulon, Napoleon continued to look for a role that corresponded to his ambition. He was not prepared to fall back into insignificance. At the same time, France was still a country in a state of emergency. The Republic had external enemies, internal opponents, and a population that suffered from inflation, hunger, war fatigue, and political uncertainty. The government changed, political camps fought each other, and the army remained one of the few instruments with which order could be established. In such moments, soldiers often become political actors, even if they initially only carry out orders. Napoleon increasingly understood that military power in France no longer served only the state, but could itself become the basis of political authority. Another decisive moment came in October 1795, when a royalist uprising against the National Convention broke out in Paris. The political situation was tense. Many opponents of the revolution hoped to restore the influence of the monarchists or at least weaken the republican order. The government needed someone determined enough to put down the uprising. Napoleon was given the opportunity to organize the defense. He again relied on artillery and had cannons set up at crucial points in the city. As the insurgents advanced, they were dispersed with cannon fire. This action was brutal, but militarily effective. Napoleon showed that he did not shy away from using force when he felt it was necessary to maintain order. This day became enormously important for his career. While others hesitated or were politically considerate, Napoleon acted quickly and harshly. For the government, he was now a man who could be relied on in a crisis. To his opponents, he was a dangerous officer who was willing to have French citizens fired at with cannons. This revealed a basic pattern of his later life. Napoleon often saw order as a prerequisite for all political freedom. If he had to choose between chaos and violence, he chose violence in the name of order. This attitude made him attractive to many contemporaries, especially those seeking stability after years of revolutionary uncertainty. But it also revealed a dark side of his rise. Napoleon was prepared to subordinate human lives to the political goal. After the suppression of the uprising, Napoleon was appointed commander of the Army of the Interior. This meant that he was now much closer to the center of power. He got to know Paris, the salons, the political networks, the importance of relationships and public impact. During this time, Josephine de Beauharnais also came more strongly into his life. She was a widow from the Society of the Directory, experienced, charming, and with important contacts. The relationship with her was personally significant, but also politically useful. Napoleon no longer moved only in barracks and on battlefields, but in a world in which social proximity, influence, and strategic marriages played a major role. His marriage to Josephine connected him to circles that could further promote his career. But Napoleon was not a man who was satisfied with a comfortable position in Paris. He wanted fame, and fame was not gained in administrative service, but in war. France was still fighting against European powers, and Italy in particular offered the opportunity to distinguish itself. The French army there had been poorly supplied, exhausted, and long neglected. Many would have regarded this command as a difficult or thankless task. Napoleon, on the other hand, saw an opportunity in it. A weak army could become an instrument of glory under a determined leader if it was properly addressed, moved quickly, and promised victory. Soon he was to do just that. Chapter 3 shows Napoleon in the decisive formative phase of his life. He was not yet the ruler who wanted to reorder Europe, but many of his later qualities were already emerging. He thought strategically, identified weak points, used artillery to great effect, acted decisively, and combined military success with political benefit. At the same time, he showed his willingness to use violence as a legitimate means of order. Toulon made him famous, Paris made him necessary, and the coming campaigns were to make him famous. Step by step, the young officer became a man who understood that in a decaying order, those who not only had dreams, but cannons, decisiveness, and the will to force history could rise. Chapter 4. The Italian Campaign: How Napoleon Became a Folk Hero. When Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the French-Italian army in the spring of 1796, he was only 26 years old. Many experienced officers viewed him with skepticism. He was young, ambitious, physically inconspicuous, and did not yet have the fame that would later surround him. But behind his slender figure was an extraordinary will. Napoleon knew that with this command he was given an opportunity that could decide his entire future. The army, he found, was in poor condition. The soldiers were poorly cared for, their clothes were worn, their boots were often torn, pay and food were lacking, morale was low. In such a situation, many generals would have waited first for better equipment, more money, and new orders from Paris. Napoleon, however, saw in the weakness of his army not only a problem, but also an opportunity. Precisely because these men had been neglected for a long time, he was able to bind them to himself with the prospect of fame, booty, and victories. The Italian campaign was of great strategic importance for France. The Republic was still fighting against European powers, especially Austria, which had strong influence in northern Italy. Italy at that time was not a unified nation-state, but a fragmented area of kingdoms, duchies, republics, and territories under foreign control. Austria ruled Lombardy and was one of the central powers hostile to the French Revolution. For France, the war in Italy offered the opportunity to weaken Austria, gain money and supplies, and carry the revolution beyond the borders. For Napoleon, he provided the stage on which he could prove that he was more than an officer who had attracted attention in Toulon and Paris through fortunate circumstances. Even in his first address to the soldiers, Napoleon showed a special sense of language and effect. He promised them not abstract ideals, but tangible rewards. He spoke of the fertile plains of Italy, of wealth, honor, and victory. In doing so, he understood that an exhausted army is not moved by orders alone. Soldiers must believe that their suffering has meaning and that their general is not wasting it, but leading it to success. Napoleon created a personal connection between himself and his men early on. He did not present himself as a distant commander, but as someone who knew their plight and promised them a way out. This ability to combine military leadership with psychological impact became one of his trademarks. Militarily, Napoleon showed a speed and determination in the Italian campaign that surprised his opponents. The Austrian and Piedmontese troops were not always clearly outnumbered, but they were separate, cumbersome, and accustomed to traditional forms of warfare. Napoleon realized that he did not have to beat them at the same time. He had to tell them apart, move quickly against an opponent, defeat him, and then turn on the next. This art of concentrating on the decisive point became the core of his early victories. In Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, and Mondovi, he used movement, deception, and speed to confuse his opponents. Within a few weeks, he forced the kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont to make peace. This cleared the way to Lombardy. The crossing of the Lodi Bridge in May 1796 became a moment that played a special role in Napoleon's own legend. Militarily, Lodi was not the biggest battle of the campaign, but symbolically it became important. French troops stormed a bridge over the Adda under heavy fire, while Austrian forces resisted. Napoleon presented himself as a determined leader who showed proximity to the front in dangerous moments. Later, he ascribed great importance to this experience, because it was there that he supposedly had the feeling for the first time that he was destined for extraordinary things. Whether this memory is to be understood in full in this way remains open. Crucially, Napoleon used Lodi to shape his image as a courageous, almost fatefully appointed general. Already here he began not only to achieve his victories, but also to turn them into narratives. After entering Milan, Napoleon became visible not only as a general, but increasingly as a political actor. In Italy, he appeared as a representative of the French Republic, speaking of liberation, reforms, and the end of old privileges. Many Italian patriots and enlightened citizens actually associated the French with hopes for political renewal. They saw Napoleon as a man who could shake the encrusted structures of princely rule. But this liberation had a double side. The French army lived off the resources of the occupied territories. Art treasures, money, supplies, and taxes were brought to France or used to supply the troops. For many people in Italy, the arrival of the French therefore meant not only freedom, but also burden, plundering, and foreign rule. Napoleon spoke the language of the revolution, but at the same time acted as a conqueror who had to finance war and secure power. It was precisely this mixture of ideology and power politics that made the Italian campaign so important. Napoleon learned that a general outside France not only had to fight, but also govern, negotiate, administer, and propagandize. He concluded treaties, reorganized territories, implemented political changes, and appeared with growing self-confidence vis-a-vis local rulers. The Directory in Paris had sent him to Italy as commander, but with each victory he became more independent. He informed Paris, but he did not always wait for instructions. He made decisions on the spot because he knew that speed was often more important than formal consultation. This created a new balance of power. France needed its victories, and that is precisely why Napoleon was able to allow himself more and more freedoms. The Austrian army tried several times to break French domination in northern Italy. The fortress of Mantua in particular became the center of fierce fighting. Mantua was strategically decisive because it supported Austrian influence in northern Italy. Napoleon had to fend off several Austrian relief attempts. This showed his ability to defeat separate enemy forces one after the other. Battles such as Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli cemented his reputation as an exceptional general. Arcole was later mythologized particularly strongly. The image of Napoleon leading his soldiers to the attack with a flag in his hand became part of a deliberate staging of heroism. Reality was more complicated and less smooth than the legend, but this shows how early Napoleon understood that political power also arises from images, symbols, and stories. The victory at Rivoli in January 1797 was one of the decisive moments of the campaign. Napoleon recognized the intentions of the Austrian forces, reacted quickly, and made clever use of the terrain. The Austrian attacks were repelled, and Mantua soon had to capitulate. This severely shook Austria's position in Italy. The young general had transformed an army that had initially been taken little seriously into a victorious force. His soldiers increasingly revered him because he had given them victories, booty, and self-confidence. In France, he became a celebrated hero. Newspapers, reports, and official announcements portrayed him as the savior of the Republic. Napoleon actively promoted this representation. He knew that fame does not only arise on the battlefield, but in public perception. The Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797 confirmed its success. Austria had to make significant concessions, and France gained influence. At the same time, it became clear how arbitrarily Napoleon was acting in the meantime. He negotiated like a statesman, not just like a soldier. It decided on territories, political orders, and the fate of entire regions. In Italy, republics dependent on France arose, which combined revolutionary principles with French control. For Napoleon, this was a school of power. He learned how not only to win battles, but how to establish a new order, create allies, intimidate opponents, and secure the political results of military victories. But the Italian campaign also revealed the moral tensions of his rise. Napoleon brought reforms, eliminated some old privileges, and supported new political structures. At the same time, he forced defeated territories to pay, had works of art transported away, and treated Italy as an area of French interests. The claim of liberation and the reality of the occupation stood side by side. Many contemporaries admired him as the bearer of a new era. Others already saw him as an ambitious power seeker who used ideals when they served him. This contradiction was to accompany his whole life. Napoleon could modernize and subjugate, inspire and exploit, order and destroy. At the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon was no longer just a successful general. He had become a political figure. His name was known in France, his army depended on him, his opponents feared him, and the Directory could no longer simply treat him like an ordinary officer. He had shown that he was able to combine war, politics, and public opinion. The young man from Corsica had become a hero of the Republic. But this fame was dangerous. For a general who is loved by his soldiers, admired by the people, and needed by the government rarely remains just a tool of others. The Italian campaign made Napoleon a national hero, but it also awakened in him the certainty that his fate was greater than a military command. France had given him a stage. Now he began to believe that this stage belonged to him. Chapter 5. Egypt and the Dream of the Orient. After his victories in Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte was a celebrated man in France. His name stood for military genius, youthful ambition, and the hope that the French Republic could hold its own against its European enemies despite all the internal crises. But it was precisely this fame that made him dangerous for the government in Paris. The Directory that governed France after the end of the most radical phase of the revolution was weak, unpopular, and marked by corruption, power struggles, and political uncertainty. A general who was revered by his soldiers and admired by the public was not only useful but also threatening to such a government. Napoleon himself knew this very well. He had experienced in Italy how much military victories could generate political power. Now he was looking for a new venue that could increase his fame and at the same time meet France's most important opponent, Great Britain. Britain was the most stubborn and dangerous enemy for France. On the European mainland, France could deploy armies against Austria, Prussia, or smaller states, occupy territories, and enforce peace treaties. It was more difficult against Great Britain. British strength lay at sea, in trading power, in the navy, and in a worldwide network of colonies, bases, and trade links. A direct invasion of England was risky, because the French fleet could hardly compete with the Royal Navy. Napoleon and other French strategists therefore thought about an indirect strike. If Britain could not be defeated on its island, perhaps its connection to India, that rich and strategically important area that was becoming increasingly important to British power, could be threatened. Egypt appeared as the key in this thinking. Whoever controlled Egypt could influence the Eastern Mediterranean, threaten trade routes, and perhaps one day open the way to India. The Egyptian expedition of 1798 was therefore a military undertaking, a political project, and a personal myth at the same time. Napoleon didn't just want to lead an army, he wanted to play a new historical role. In the European imagination of the time, the Orient was a space full of secrets, ancient empires, biblical memories, scientific curiosity, and imperial fantasies. Egypt combined the greatness of antiquity with the strategic importance of the present. Napoleon dreamed of appearing there not only as a conqueror, but as the founder of a new order, as a man who combined science, administration, and power. Therefore, he took not only soldiers with him, but also scholars, engineers, artists, naturalists, and linguists. This accompaniment was extraordinary. It was intended to show that France did not only come with cannons, but also with knowledge, surveying, research, and the claim of enlightenment. The crossing to Egypt was surprisingly successful at first. Napoleon escaped from the British fleet, took Malta on the way, and reached the Egyptian coast with his army. Malta was an important base in the Mediterranean, and its capture once again demonstrated Napoleon's ability to quickly seize political and military opportunities. But the real destination was further east. When the French landed in Egypt, they encountered a world that was foreign to them. The country was formally under Ottoman sovereignty, but in practice it was strongly influenced by the Mamluks, a military elite that had exerted great influence for centuries. Napoleon did not present himself to the Egyptians as an enemy of Islam, but tried to present himself as a liberator from the rule of the Mamluks. In proclamations, he declared that the French respected religion and wanted to bring justice. These words were politically calculated. Napoleon knew that a small European army could not rule permanently in a foreign country by force alone. It needed at least a semblance of legitimacy. But there was a deep gulf between the proclamation and reality. For many Egyptians, the French were foreign occupiers, no matter what language they used. The cultural differences, the religious tensions, the harshness of military occupation, and the interference in existing power relations soon led to mistrust and resistance. Napoleon could present himself as a friend of Islam, but he remained the general of a revolutionary European power that had come with arms. His rule was based on military control, administration, and intimidation. Nevertheless, he tried to create order. He had administrative structures set up, local elites involved, taxes organized, and information collected about the country, population, and economy. For him, Egypt became an experimental field of imperial administration. Militarily, the famous Battle of the Pyramids soon took place on July 21, 1798. The French army encountered the Mamluks, whose cavalry was known for courage, agility, and personal martial arts. Napoleon positioned his troops in large squares, which were particularly effective against cavalry attacks. The disciplined infantry, supported by artillery, withstood the attacks and inflicted a heavy defeat on the Mamluks. The victory was impressive and immediately became part of Napoleonic legend. The proximity to the pyramids gave the event an almost mythical atmosphere. Napoleon knew how to exploit this symbolism. The idea of French soldiers triumphing in the shadow of humanity's oldest monuments was a perfect fit for his desire to join a long line of great conquerors and founders of states. But the triumph was short-lived. A few days later, France suffered a catastrophe that changed the entire expedition. In the Battle of Abukir, also known as the Battle of the Nile, Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed a large part of the French fleet at the beginning of August 1798. This practically cut off Napoleon's army in Egypt. The connection to France was severely disrupted. Supplies and withdrawals became problematic. The victory on land could not compensate for the defeat at sea. This is where the central weakness of the expedition became apparent. Napoleon was able to achieve brilliant victories on land, but Britain's naval power remained a border that he could not overcome. The destruction of the fleet turned a bold strategic project into a dangerous trap. Napoleon reacted with his characteristic mixture of energy, propaganda, and harshness. He tried to present the situation as manageable, to maintain the morale of his troops, and to continue the administration of Egypt. At the same time, violence increased. In Cairo, there was an uprising against the French occupation in October 1798. Napoleon had him brutally suppressed. Mosques were shelled, suspects were pursued, resistance was met with severity. Here again the contradiction of his actions became apparent. He spoke of order, progress, and liberation, but when his power was threatened, he resorted to ruthless violence without hesitation. The Egyptian population was not to be convinced, but controlled when conviction was not enough. Despite all the military and political problems, the expedition produced scientifically significant results. The scholars who traveled with them examined plants, animals, buildings, languages, landscapes, and the history of the country. Later, the Rosetta Stone, which was found by French soldiers in 1799 and contributed decisively to the deciphering of hieroglyphics, became particularly famous. Even if this scientific yield does not justify the violence of the expedition, it does show the special character of the enterprise. It was conquest and research at the same time, imperial power grab, and an expression of European curiosity. France not only wanted to occupy Egypt, but also to measure, describe, and mentally grasp it. Knowledge thus became a tool of domination itself. In 1799, Napoleon led his army further into Syria to forestall a possible Ottoman counteroffensive and perhaps realize a larger Oriental vision. But this campaign was difficult and costly. The siege of Acre failed, diseases spread, especially the plague, and the French troops suffered from exhaustion, heat, and supply difficulties. Napoleon won individual battles, but he did not achieve the decisive breakthrough. Acre became a frontier of his dream. The idea of advancing further east from Egypt and perhaps threatening British interests in India proved far less realistic than his imagination had allowed. When Napoleon learned of the difficult political situation in France, he made a decision that reveals a lot about his character. He secretly left Egypt in August 1799 and returned to France, leaving his army behind. Militarily, this was questionable, but humanly it seemed like a betrayal of the soldiers who had followed him. Politically, however, it was a masterpiece of self-rescue for him. He realized that his future was no longer in Egypt, but in Paris. The expedition had not achieved its great goal. Britain had not been decisively weakened, Egypt did not remain permanently French, and the French army was isolated. But Napoleon managed to cover up the failure in such a way that his personal fame was hardly destroyed. News arrived slowly in France, and he was once again able to present himself as a victorious general. The Egyptian expedition was thus a turning point. It showed Napoleon's vast imagination, his drive to think beyond Europe, and his ability to combine war, science, propaganda, and politics. But it also showed its limits: British naval power, the difficulties of imperial occupation, the resistance of foreign societies, and the danger of putting strategic dreams above real possibilities. Egypt was not a final triumph for Napoleon, but a brilliantly staged adventure with deep cracks. But it was precisely from this adventure that he returned at a moment when France demanded order. His army remained in the desert, but Napoleon reappeared in Paris as a man of destiny. And there the next, even greater opportunity awaited. Chapter 6. The coup d'état of 18 Brumaire and the end of the revolution. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France from Egypt in the autumn of 1799, he entered a country that was still a republic on the outside, but on the inside seemed tired, torn, and disoriented. 10 years of revolution had fundamentally changed France. The old monarchy had been overthrown, the privileges of the nobility had been abolished, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Civil had heralded a new political age, and yet the great hopes had not resulted in a stable order. Instead, the French had experienced violence, civil war, terror, economic crises, hunger, political purges, and endless power struggles. Many people did not want to go back to the old world of the Bourbons, but they had also had enough of insecurity and ideological radicalization. It was precisely in this mood that Napoleon could appear as a savior. He came back not as a theoretician, not as a party leader, and not as a speaker at the great meetings, but as a victorious general, as a man of action, as someone who could supposedly put things in order where politicians had failed. The Directory, which had ruled France since 1795, was badly battered at that time. It was supposed to secure a moderate republican order and prevent either the monarchists or the radical Jacobins from regaining power. But in practice, this government was unstable, unpopular, and corrupt. 5 directors were at the head of the state, but their power was based less on genuine approval than on political maneuvers, election interference, police action, and military support. Again and again, election results were changed or political opponents eliminated when they became dangerous to the regime. As a result, the Republic lost moral credibility. She continued to speak of freedom and popular sovereignty, but often acted out of fear of her own people. The revolution, which had once begun in the name of political participation, had arrived in a system that only asserted itself through control and emergency solutions. Napoleon recognized this weakness immediately. His stay in Egypt had not prevented him from closely following developments in France. He knew that military glory alone was not enough if he wanted to gain political power. He needed allies within the system, men who wanted to change the Republic but needed a popular general to carry out this plan. One of the most important of these men was Emmanuel Joseph Size, an experienced revolutionary and political thinker who had already become famous in 1789 with his work on the Third Estate. Size was convinced that the board of directors could no longer be saved. He wanted a new constitution, a stronger executive, and a system that could tame the chaotic forces of the revolution. What he lacked was a sword. Napoleon could be that sword. An alliance developed between the two men out of calculation, not trust. Size initially saw Napoleon as a tool, a popular general whose fame could secure the planned change of power. Napoleon, on the other hand, saw Size and other political conspirators as the door to power. Both probably believed that they could use the other. But Napoleon had a decisive advantage. He not only understood the language of power, but also possessed the aura of victor. People knew his battles, his proclamations, his images. Even the Egyptian expedition, which had by no means been a clear strategic success, had not destroyed his reputation. In the public perception, he remained the man of Italy, the general of Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli, the bold conqueror who had returned from the desert while France was looking for leadership. The conspirators' plan was aimed at eliminating the Directory and putting pressure on the legislative councils. According to the revolutionary calendar, the coup d'état was dated to the 18th Brumaire of the year 8, which corresponded to November 9, 1799. The conspirators used the fear of an alleged Jacobin threat to justify the transfer of the councils from Paris to St. Cloud. There they should be easier to control, far from the direct pressure of the Parisian public. Napoleon was given the supreme command of the troops in Paris. This meant that military power was in his hands. On paper, everything should look legal. In reality, it was a carefully prepared attack on the existing constitution. The first day went largely according to plan. Several directors resigned or were politically eliminated, rendering the government unable to act. But the decisive moment came the following day, when Napoleon appeared before the councils in St. Cloud. Here it became clear that although he was an extraordinary general, he was not yet a sovereign parliamentary speaker. Before the Council of Elders, and especially before the Council of the 500, he came under great pressure. Members of Parliament insulted him, accused him of breaking the Constitution, and called for compliance with the law. Some are said to have pressed him. The situation became chaotic. For a moment, the coup d'état was by no means certain. Napoleon, who could make decisions in cold blood on battlefields, seemed insecure and overwhelmed in the political arena. Power hung by a thread. It was not Napoleon's oratory skills that were decisive, but once again the military and the determination of his allies. His brother Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the Council of the 500, played an important role. He portrayed the deputies as threatened by fanatics and helped justify the intervention of the soldiers. Finally, troops under Joachim Murat cleared the meeting room. Thus, the Republican appearance had finally been replaced by military force. The deputies who were still left or who submitted decided on the foundations of a new order. The board of directors was over. It was replaced by the consulate, initially with 3 consuls, among whom Napoleon very quickly became the dominant figure. The coup d'état of the 18th Brumaire was not a bloody massacre like other events of the Revolution, but its significance was enormous. It marked the end of the Revolutionary Republic in its previous form. The revolution was not simply extinguished. Many of their social and legal achievements remained. Equality before the law, the abolition of feudal privileges, the new meaning of talent and achievement, nationalized administration, and the idea of a modern state have not been reversed. But political freedom, open debate, and the hope of genuine republican self-government were severely restricted. Napoleon took over the revolution, but he tamed it. He turned a movement that had once risen up against unchecked power into a system that increasingly revolved around his own person. This was precisely its historical peculiarity. Napoleon did not present himself as an enemy of the revolution. He knew that an open return to the old monarchy would have repelled many French people. Instead, he presented himself as the consummator of the revolution. He promised order without a return to feudalism, authority without Bourbon rule, stability without completely renouncing the achievements of 1789. This message was attractive to many people. Farmers wanted to keep their land, citizens wanted legal certainty, civil servants wanted regulated careers, businessmen wanted stable conditions, soldiers wanted fame and provision. Napoleon gave them the feeling that the revolution could finally stop devouring itself and pass into a fixed order. But the price was high. Power was now increasingly centralized. Elections and referendums were supposed to show approval, but were not free control of the rule. The press was restricted, political opponents were monitored, and the administration was built up in such a way that it could efficiently enforce orders from above. Napoleon understood that modern power is not just personal charisma, but institutions, files, police reports, prefects, courts, schools, tax lists, and armies. The coup d'état was therefore not just a dramatic political moment, but the beginning of a new style of rule. Out of the revolutionary unrest arose a state that was to be more rational, tighter, and more effective than anything France had known before. For Napoleon personally, Brumaire was the decisive step from fame to power. Until then, he had won victories in the name of France. Now he began to shape France according to his own will. He was not yet emperor, but the direction was already recognizable. The other consuls soon stood in his shadow. The new constitution gave him enormous powers, and the public narrative portrayed him as the man who had saved the country from chaos, extremism, and weakness. Many French people accepted this development or even welcomed it because, after years of fear and exhaustion, they wanted peace at home above all. Freedom was a big word, but bread, security, and order were more immediate for many. The coup d'état of the 18th Brumaire shows Napoleon in all his contradictions. He was a child of the revolution, because without it his rise would hardly have been possible. At the same time, he ended the political revolution by replacing its institutions with personal rule. He preserved parts of their heritage, but deprived them of the open democratic spirit. He promised stability and indeed brought order, but this order was based on control. He presented himself as the savior of the republic, but made himself the center of the state. At that moment it became clear that Napoleon was not only a brilliant general. He was a political power seeker who had understood that the tired revolution was looking for a winner who would complete it. On the 18th Brumaire, France found this winner, and Napoleon found the way to rule. Chapter 7. The First Consul, Order, Reforms, and New Power. When Napoleon Bonaparte took over as head of France after the coup d'état of 18 Brumaire, he was not yet officially emperor or king. He called himself First Consul, a title that was deliberately reminiscent of the Roman Republic and was intended to maintain the appearance that France still had a republican order. But behind this facade, power changed very quickly. The new constitution of Year 8 placed 3 consuls at the head of the state, but in practice Napoleon was the decisive man. The other consuls had advisory and supporting functions, while he set the actual direction. This marked the beginning of a phase in which France actually became more stable after years of revolution, violence, and insecurity, but at the same time came more and more under the control of a single man. Napoleon understood very well why many French people were willing to give him power. The country was tired. The revolution had brought great promises, but also blood, hunger, political persecution, religious conflicts, civil war, and constant insecurity. Many people did not want to return to the old feudal system, but they longed for peace, for reliable laws, for security of property, and for a state that functioned. Napoleon offered exactly that. He presented himself as a man of order, not as a returnee to the old monarchy, but as the consummator of a revolution that was finally to take firm shape. A large part of his political strength lay in this self-presentation. He basically told the French, "The revolution has brought you equality before the law and new opportunities, but I will protect you from its chaos." The new government was therefore not simply consolidated by open violence, but by a mixture of consent, control, and efficiency. Napoleon had plebiscites held to confirm his rule. However, these votes were not free democratic procedures in the modern sense. They served above all to make approval visible and to give the new system the appearance of national legitimacy. Napoleon was aware that modern rule must not only command, but also persuade and stage. He didn't need every Frenchman as an enthusiastic supporter, but he wanted to create the impression that the nation was behind him. This combination of plebiscitary approval and authoritarian control later became a core of his style of rule. A central instrument of his power was the administration. Napoleon built a state that could be tightly controlled from Paris. Particularly important were the prefects, who were supposed to enforce the interests of the central government in the departments. They were not independent regional representatives, but officials of the state, responsible to the government and ultimately to Napoleon. Through them, Paris was able to have an impact even in the provinces. Taxes, police, road construction, public order, economic measures, and political surveillance were better coordinated than before. This administrative state was one of Napoleon's most enduring creations. He made France more efficient, but also more controllable. Freedom in the local area was limited, while the assertiveness of the central power grew. The finances also had to be put in order. The revolution had caused not only political, but also economic upheavals. Inflation, uncertain government revenues, and mistrust of the currency had weighed on the country. Napoleon knew that a strong state could not exist without stable finances. As a result, the tax system was improved, the collection of taxes was organized more reliably, and the Banque de France in 1800 was created as an important institution to strengthen confidence in the financial system. For Napoleon, money was not only an economic issue, but a basis of military and political power. Armies had to be paid, civil servants paid, roads built, and administrative structures financed. Order also meant that the state could once again generate predictable revenues. Napoleon's reform work in the field of law became particularly famous. The Code Civil, which was introduced in 1804 and later became known as the Code Napoleon, was one of the most consequential legal innovations in Europe. He unified the law, strengthened the equality of male citizens before the law, protected property, and affirmed many of the social outcomes of the revolution. Feudal privileges were not restored. Careers were to be possible through performance, and bourgeois property was given clear legal security. For many French people, especially farmers and citizens, this was decisive. They could trust that the achievements of the revolution would not simply be reversed. Napoleon thus bound large parts of society to his system. But the Code Civil also showed the limits of this new order. Women were legally clearly subordinated to men, especially within the family. The father was given great authority, marriage was hierarchically regulated, and political participation remained severely restricted anyway. The equality that Napoleon consolidated was therefore above all an equality of male citizens before the state and before the right to property. It was modern compared to the old class society, but far from comprehensive freedom. This pattern was repeated in many areas of his rule. Napoleon preserved revolutionary achievements if they strengthened order and performance. It limited them if they favored political unrest, social independence, or resistance to the central power. Another difficult area was the relationship with the Church. The revolution had hit the Catholic Church hard. Church property had been nationalized, clergy had to take oaths to the new order, and a deep religious conflict had arisen in many regions. Especially in the countryside, Catholicism remained an important part of many people's lives. Napoleon was not personally a pious ruler in the traditional sense, but he recognized the political importance of religion. He wanted to end the religious conflict and put the Church at the service of the state order. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII in 1801 was therefore a clever compromise. Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the majority of French people, but the Church did not fully regain its old political power. Bishops were co-determined by the state, clergy were paid, and the Church had to fit into the new order. This procedure shows Napoleon's political method very clearly. He was rarely a man of pure ideology. Above all, he asked what benefited the state and what stabilized its rule. With the former revolutionaries, he spoke of law, achievement, and national greatness. He promised the farmers security of property. He gave the citizens order and administration. He offered the Church recognition, but no real independence. He opened up the possibility for former nobles to return to his system as long as they served him. In this way, he created a new elite that was based less on old birth than on loyalty, ability, and benefit to the state. This elite was not democratic, but it was more dynamic than the old aristocracy. Education also played a major role for Napoleon. He wanted to train loyal, capable officials and officers. The founding and promotion of lycées served to prepare young men for administration, the military, and the state. For him, education was not primarily a space for free self-development, but a means of forming useful civil servants. Discipline, performance, hierarchy, and loyalty were the focus. This created an education system that could enable advancement, but at the same time was strongly controlled by the state. Once again, the double character of his reforms becomes apparent. They modernized France, but at the same time they placed people in a strict system. While Napoleon created order at home, France remained involved in a hostile world in terms of foreign policy. The European monarchies distrusted the French Republic, and even more so a general who had defeated their armies. Nevertheless, Napoleon managed to make peace at times. The Peace of Lunéville with Austria in 1801 and the Peace of Amiens with Great Britain in 1802 gave France a brief respite. For many French people, this reinforced the impression that Napoleon was not only bringing order at home, but also national security abroad. After years of war, he looked like a ruler who could establish stability. But this peace was fragile. The rivalry with Great Britain remained, and Napoleon's increase in power on the continent was hardly acceptable for other states in the long term. In 1802, Napoleon had himself consul for life. This step was a clear sign that his rule was no longer to be understood as a temporary emergency solution. The Republic remained in name, but its center was now one person. Napoleon collected offices, influence, and symbolic power. He lived in palaces, determined political decisions, controlled the administration, and had his successes publicly celebrated. The press was censored, opponents were monitored or eliminated, and political debates were forced within narrow limits. Anyone who wanted peace, property, and national greatness could accept this. Those who sought political freedom realized more and more clearly that Napoleon did not lead the revolution to democracy, but to a new form of personal rule. Nevertheless, it would be too easy to describe this phase only as a path to dictatorship. For many contemporaries, Napoleon's consulate was indeed a relief. Roads, administration, law, finances, education, and religious affairs were ordered. The state regained its ability to act. The fear of a return of terror or a monarchist restoration decreased. Farmers, citizens, civil servants, and soldiers could find advantages in this system. Napoleon knew how to bind different social groups to him by giving them not complete freedom, but security, recognition, and opportunities for advancement. His rule was therefore based not only on oppression, but also on a real need for stability. At the end of the consulate, France was stronger than before. The revolution had not disappeared, but it had lost its open, unpredictable dynamic. The revolutionary experiment became a centralized state, political clubs became administrative acts, debates became orders, freedom became order. Napoleon had found his role. He was no longer just the general who won battles, and no longer just the man who survived a coup d'état. He had become the architect of a new France. But the next step was already laid out in this architecture. Whoever has power for life, who shapes the law, controls the administration, controls the army, and allows himself to be celebrated as the savior of the nation, is close to the crown. Napoleon still called himself First Consul, but France was already moving towards the moment when the consul was to become an emperor. Chapter 8. The Coronation as Emperor and the Break with the Old World. When Napoleon Bonaparte accepted the imperial crown in 1804, it was more than a personal highlight of his power. It was a symbolic moment in which the entire history of the French Revolution seemed to condense. A man who came from a rather modest Corsican noble family, who had risen through the turmoil of the revolution and presented himself as the guardian of its achievements, now rose above the Republic and assumed a title reminiscent of monarchy, dynasty, and imperial rule. For his followers, this was the necessary completion of a new order. For his opponents, it was a betrayal of the revolution. It is precisely in this tension that the historical significance of Napoleon's coronation lies. It was neither a simple return to the old monarchy nor a mere continuation of republican ideals. It was something new, a modern personal rule that made use of revolutionary results and at the same time placed it under the control of an emperor. The path to the imperial crown did not begin with a ceremony in Notre Dame. Napoleon had already gradually expanded his power during the consulate. He had become first consul, then consul for life, and each of these stages was confirmed by the apparent consent of the people. Referendums were intended to show that his power was not based on birth or divine right, but on the will of the nation. But this approval was directed, controlled, and politically staged. Napoleon understood that after 1789, no ruler in France could simply act like the Bourbon kings before the Revolution. He had to justify his authority differently. He needed not only a crown, but a story. This narrative was, France had finally been pacified after years of chaos, the revolution had been saved, order had been restored, and only strong lasting leadership could prevent the country from plunging again into civil war, terror, or monarchist restoration. An important reason for the establishment of the empire was the question of stability. Napoleon had many enemies. Royalists wanted the return of the Bourbons, Republican opponents saw him as a tyrant, and monarchies abroad feared his power. Assassination plans and conspiracies reinforced the impression that the rule of the first consul was threatened. His supporters argued that France needed a hereditary order so that a new power struggle would not break out immediately upon Napoleon's death or assassination. This logic was not only a pretext, it carried weight from the point of view of many contemporaries. The revolution had shown how dangerous unresolved questions of power could be. A hereditary empire promised continuity. But the price for this was high. The Republic, which had once risen up against the hereditary power of a king, now created a new hereditary rule. Napoleon himself was fully aware of the symbolic significance of this step. He didn't just want to be king. The title of king would have been too reminiscent of the Bourbons, of Versailles, of old France, of the world that had been overthrown in 1789. The imperial title, on the other hand, offered a different historical depth. He referred to Rome, to Charlemagne, to universal power and military greatness. Napoleon was thus able to present himself as the founder of a new dynasty, not as an imitator of the old one. He wanted to show that his rule did not come from centuries of descent, but from achievement, victory, and national approval. This was precisely where his attempt lay to combine the incompatible, revolutionary advancement and monarchical dignity, popular sovereignty and personal rule, modern administration, and ancient symbolism. The coronation took place on December 2, 1804 in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Even the choice of location was significant. Notre Dame stood for the religious and historical depth of France, but Paris was also the city of the Revolution. Pope Pius VII was present, which was intended to give spiritual dignity to the ceremony. But Napoleon made sure that the Pope did not appear as the actual donor of power. The most famous moment of the ceremony was when Napoleon put the crown on himself. Historically, this scene is often interpreted as an expression of his tremendous self-confidence. It showed that his power did not come from the hand of the Church. The Pope should bless, but not determine. Napoleon wanted to make it visible that he had not received his crown like a dependent monarch, but had taken it for himself, based on his victories, his state, and the claimed will of the nation. Josephine was also crowned. For Napoleon, this scene was both personal and political. Josephine had introduced him to the Society of the Directory, had been part of his rise, and embodied a connection between the old aristocratic world, revolutionary experience, and Napoleon's present. But behind the glamour of the coronation, there was already a problem that would later become decisive for Napoleon's dynasty. Josephine did not give him an heir. For a ruler who wanted to establish a lasting dynasty, this was more than a private matter. It touched the core of the new empire. Because if Napoleon wanted to make his power hereditary, he also had to secure the future of his lineage. The coronation gave him the title, but not yet the dynastic security. The staging of the empire was carefully planned. Clothing, symbols, court ceremonies, titles, and coats of arms were deliberately designed. Napoleon created a new nobility, distributed dignities and offices, and surrounded himself with an elite that owed its position to him. This new elite was not based solely on birth, but on service, loyalty, military success, and administrative talent. Nevertheless, its function increasingly resembled the old courtly structures. People who had risen through the revolution against aristocratic privileges now received titles and ranked themselves. Napoleon did not simply want to restore the ancien regime. He wanted to create an elite that was more dynamic, performance-related, and more closely tied to the state. But for many Republicans, it seemed bitter that the ideals of freedom and equality once again gave rise to orders, courts, and hierarchies. At the same time, Napoleon remained careful not to touch the most important social results of the revolution. The property of the peasants, the abolition of feudal rights, access to careers in the state and in the military, equality before the law for male citizens, all this was preserved. This is precisely why his empire could count on broader approval than a simple return of the Bourbons. Many French people accepted the new monarchy because it was not the old one. They feared less the title of emperor than the loss of what they had won since 1789. Napoleon guaranteed them property, order, and national glory. In return, he demanded obedience, political calm, and the willingness to follow his wars. In Europe, the coronation of the emperor was viewed with suspicion and concern. The old monarchies continued to see Napoleon as an upstart, even if he now wore a crown himself. His empire was particularly dangerous for them because it called into question the traditional idea of legitimate rule. Napoleon had not risen to the top through centuries of dynasty, but through revolution, military, and political staging. He thus proved that a new kind of monarchy was possible, born of crisis and achievement, not of old lineage. This was a challenge for Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain. They may have distrusted each other, but they all recognized that Napoleon's power threatened the balance of Europe. The crowning glory therefore also meant an aggravation of the foreign policy situation. France was no longer just a revolutionary republic defending itself, but an empire with expansive claims. Napoleon saw himself as the architect of a new European order. His victories were not only intended to secure France, but also to reshape the continent. The Holy Roman Empire, the German states, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and other areas increasingly came under the influence of French politics. The imperial title gave this claim a greater symbolic force. Napoleon wanted to be seen not only as a French ruler, but as a shaper of Europe. But this was precisely where the danger lay. The higher Napoleon climbed, the more difficult it became to limit his power. As a general, he had needed victories to rise. As first consul, he had to put things in order to legitimize his rule. As emperor, he now needed lasting fame, dynastic security, and international recognition. Each of these demands drove him further. An emperor born of military success could hardly afford to stand still. Peace could have stabilized his power, but Napoleon's system also thrived on movement, prestige, and the constant affirmation of his superiority. The crown made him bigger, but it tied him even tighter to the expectation of being invincible. For France, the coronation of the emperor was a moment of brilliant self-assurance. Many saw Napoleon as the man who had led the country out of chaos and weakness. Others saw it as the final death of Republican hope. The truth lay in the tension between the two points of view. Napoleon did not end the revolution by completely destroying its results. He ended it by turning it into a state based on law, administration, military, and personal authority. He took the energy of 1789, the opportunities for advancement, the break with old privileges, the national mobilization, and put them under a crown. Thus, December 2nd, 1804 was not just a feast day of an ambitious man. It was a turning point in European history. Not only Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned in Notre Dame. A new political reality was crowned, born of revolution and war, of a hunger for order and the will to power, of modernization and subjugation. The old world had not simply returned, but Republican freedom had not been realized either. The Napoleonic Empire arose between the two. It promised greatness, stability, and fame. But within him lay the next question that was to shake Europe. How far would a man go who believed he had to obtain his crown through victories? Chapter 9. Austerlitz and the pinnacle of military ingenuity. When Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power as Emperor of the French in 1805, his reign was still young, but already surrounded by enormous tensions. The coronation had given France a new form of monarchical stability, but it had also increased the fears of the European powers. Great Britain continued to regard Napoleon as the greatest threat to the European balance and to its own trading power. Austria wanted to regain its lost influence. Russia increasingly acted as a protecting power against French expansion, and Prussia also watched with suspicion as France changed the political order of Central Europe. Napoleon had stabilized France internally, but externally his empire was surrounded by opponents who wanted to either contain or overthrow him. The War of 1805 therefore became a decisive test for the new empire. Originally, Napoleon had big plans against Great Britain. In Boulogne on the Channel coast, he gathered a huge army that was being prepared for a possible invasion of England. Tens of thousands of soldiers were drilled, landing craft were collected, camps were set up, and the army was kept on constant standby. But Napoleon knew that an invasion was only possible if the French fleet could gain control of the English Channel for a short time. This was exactly where the problem lay. Great Britain was superior at sea. The Royal Navy was experienced, well-led, and strategically strong enough that France found it difficult to force a safe passage. The dream of an invasion of England therefore remained dependent on maritime conditions, which Napoleon could not fully control. His real strength was not on the sea, but on land. When Austria and Russia formed up against him, he turned this situation into a new opportunity in a flash. The Boulogne army became the Grande Armée, one of the most powerful military machines of its time. Napoleon had not only gathered his troops, but also trained them, organized them over the years, and accustomed them to fast movements. The Grande Armée consisted of corps that could march, fight, and support each other independently. This system gave Napoleon enormous operational flexibility. His army could advance on a broad front, live faster than lumbering opponents, but then concentrate at the decisive moment. It was precisely this ability that was to make the difference in the campaign of 1805. While his enemies were still struggling with slow lines of communication, separate armies, and unclear coordination, Napoleon moved his troops at a speed that overwhelmed his opponents. The first major blow was against the Austrian army under General Mack. which was stationed near Ulm in southern Germany. Napoleon led his troops in a wide arc around the Austrian position, cutting connections and forcing Mack into a strategic trap. The campaign of Ulm was less a classic decisive battle than a masterpiece of movement. Without a major bloody main battle, Napoleon managed to bring a significant Austrian army to capitulation. In October 1805, tens of thousands of Austrian soldiers surrendered near Ulm. This was a shock for Europe. Napoleon had shown that his army was not only strong, but that he was waging war on a higher level. He did not always seek direct confrontation, but rather encirclement, isolation, and the destruction of the enemy's ability to act. But the success of Ulm was overshadowed by news that made Napoleon's strategic limits painfully visible. On October 21, 1805, Admiral Nelson defeated the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar. This finally destroyed the hope of an invasion of Great Britain. Napoleon could smash armies on the continent, but he could not break British naval power. This defeat at sea did not immediately change the war in favor of the coalition, because Austria was already badly hit, but in the long term Trafalgar was of enormous importance. Britain remained unassailable, could continue to trade, grant loans, and finance continental alliances against France. Napoleon won the great victories on land, but his mightiest enemy remained out of his reach. After Ulm, Napoleon moved to Vienna. The Austrian capital was occupied by French troops in November 1805. This was a humiliating situation for Austria, but the war was not yet decided. The Russian army under Tsar Alexander I and General Kutuzov was still in the field, and Austrian forces were not completely destroyed. Napoleon was deep in enemy territory, far from France, with supply lines that needed to be protected. His opponents hoped to put him in a difficult position by gaining time, reinforcements, and joining forces. Napoleon therefore had to force a decision before his strategic position became dangerous. This is exactly where his psychological skills became apparent. He did not just want to accept a battle, but to get his opponents to fight it under conditions of his own choosing. This opportunity presented itself at Austerlitz in Moravia, near today's Slavkov-Ubrna in the Czech Republic. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation as emperor, the battle took place, which later became famous as the Battle of the Three Emperors, because Napoleon, Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Franz II were directly involved in this war. Napoleon set up his army in such a way that it seemed vulnerable. His right flank in particular appeared weak. This was no coincidence. He wanted to tempt the Allies to attack there, to move their forces to the south and thereby expose their center. It was a risky plan, because an actual breached cross could have had catastrophic consequences. But Napoleon trusted in the discipline of his troops, in the timely arrival of reinforcements, and above all, in his ability to draw the enemy into the desired movement. The Allies actually responded to this apparent weakness. Their plan was to encircle Napoleon's right flank and cut him off from his connections. To do this, they had to withdraw troops from the Pratzen Plateau, a central height that dominated the battlefield. Napoleon recognized the moment he had been waiting for. When the Allied center was weakened, he had his troops under Marshal Soult advance against the plateau. The attack on the Mitzen Heights became the decisive moment of the battle. French soldiers advanced in the fog and morning light, breaking through the weakened center and splitting the Allied army. What had begun as an apparent weakness of Napoleon turned into a trap. The battle now developed rapidly in favor of the French. While the Allied center was breaking up, the troops on the wings were in trouble. The French army used its internal unity, its leadership, and its better coordination. Napoleon kept track of things and strengthened the decisive points. His marshals and generals performed their duties with great precision. It was particularly clear how much the Grande Armée was attuned to the will and way of thinking of its emperor. It was not just a collection of brave soldiers, but an instrument that combined movement, firepower, and decision. Austerlitz therefore became the epitome of Napoleonic warfare, deceiving the enemy, tempting him to take the wrong step, hitting the center and forcing the decision. The victory was overwhelming. The Austro-Russian army was badly defeated, its order fell apart, and the political shock was enormous. For Napoleon, Austerlitz was the most brilliant triumph of his career. Even more than Lodi, Rivoli, or Marengo, this battle became a proof of his military genius. It was not just a victory by bravery or outnumbering, but by planning, deception, timing, and psychological superiority. Napoleon had not simply defeated his opponents, he had made them carry out his plan themselves. In memory, Austerlitz therefore became the ideal Napoleonic battle, the perfect combination of strategy, tactics, and the will to rule. The consequences were enormous. Austria had to make peace. The Treaty of Pressburg in December 1805 forced the Habsburg Empire to lose territory and confirmed France's supremacy. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed since the Middle Ages, finally entered its last crisis and was dissolved in 1806 after Napoleon had created the Confederation of the Rhine as a French-dominated union of German states. Emperor Francis II laid down the Roman-German imperial crown and remained Emperor of Austria as Francis I. This marked the end of a centuries-old political order in Central Europe. Austerlitz was therefore not only a military victory, but an event that changed the map of Europe. Napoleon proved that battles could destroy states, devalue titles, and end entire historical structures. But the triumph also had dangerous consequences for Napoleon himself. Austerlitz strengthened his belief in his own infallibility. Anyone who could defeat a coalition of Austria and Russia so brilliantly, who took Vienna and shook the Old Reich, could easily come to the conclusion that almost any political problem could be solved by speed, will, and military decision. The victory increased the emperor's fame, but it also raised expectations. France expected further greatness, its soldiers expected further victories, its opponents expected further expansion. Napoleon had shown Europe that he was almost unassailable on the battlefield. But it was precisely in this way that he strengthened the resistance against himself. Every defeated power waited for the next moment of revenge. Morally, Austerlitz was not a pure triumph of genius either. Behind the shining maps, the maneuvers, and the famous orders stood thousands of dead and wounded. Entire regiments were smashed, families lost sons, and lands were reorganized according to the needs of the victors. Napoleon spoke of glory, order, and historical necessity, but for many people his victories meant occupation, levies, recruitment, and political dependence. The admiration for his military art must therefore not obscure the fact that his genius was always associated with human suffering. It is precisely this tension that makes it so difficult to classify. He was a master of war, but war remained a tool of violence. After Austerlitz, Napoleon was at the height of his reputation. He had humiliated France's enemies, confirmed his imperial dignity, and showed Europe that the new French power was supported not only by revolutionary zeal, but by a superior military organization. The Grande Armée became the symbol of an era in which movement, discipline, national mobilization, and personal leadership challenged the old armies of the princely states. Napoleon seemed to many contemporaries like a man who could steer history himself. But this is exactly where the dangerous side of his success began. Every victory made the next war more likely. Every reorganization of Europe created new enmity. Every triumph deepened the dependence of his system on military glory. Austerlitz was the pinnacle of his genius. But from a climax, at some point the path no longer leads upwards. Chapter 10. Continental Blockade, Propaganda, and the Economic War against England. After the triumph of Austerlitz, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his glory, but one opponent remained beyond his reach: Great Britain. On the European mainland, Napoleon was able to defeat armies, occupy capitals, enforce peace treaties, and break up old political orders. He was able to use his military strength directly against Austria, Prussia, and Russia. But Britain was different. The island power had a huge fleet, a worldwide trade network, and a financial power that allowed it to support ever-new alliances against France. Since the defeat of the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in October 1805, it was clear that Napoleon would not be able to defeat England directly. An invasion had become practically impossible as long as the Royal Navy dominated the sea. Napoleon was thus faced with a strategic problem that was to occupy him for years. How do you defeat an enemy that cannot be reached militarily? The answer Napoleon found was economic warfare. If Britain could not be beaten by a landing, then its economic basis was to be destroyed. Great Britain lived on trade, industry, colonies, credit, and exports. His power was based not only on ships and cannons, but also on the flow of goods, banks, insurance companies, ports, markets, and factories. Napoleon believed that if he could close the European continent to British goods, Britain would be bled dry economically. Without markets, without revenues, and without access to important ports, British society was to be put under pressure, the government forced to make peace and France's dominance on the continent secured. This consideration gave rise to the Continental Blockade, one of the most ambitious and at the same time most problematic projects of his rule. In November 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. In it, he declared the British Isles to be effectively blockaded and banned trade with Great Britain. British goods were no longer to be sold on the European continent. British ships were no longer to enter ports. British letters and trade connections were to be interrupted. Later, these measures were tightened by further decrees. Napoleon wanted to force not only France, but all states dependent on or influenced by it into the system. That was the decisive point. The Continental Blockade could only work if almost all of Europe participated. A single country could ban British goods, but when other ports remained open, traders found ways to circumvent the bans. Therefore, the economic war against England became at the same time an instrument of power vis-a-vis Europe. Anyone who belonged to Napoleon's system had to submit to his trade order. On paper, this strategy seemed logical. Britain was dependent on foreign trade, and the European continent was an important market. But in reality, the system was difficult to implement. Europe consisted of coasts, islands, neutral ports, smuggling routes, trade interests, and local needs. Merchants wanted to earn, consumers wanted goods, port cities lived on exchange, and many states were economically closely linked to British trade. Colonial goods such as sugar, coffee, cotton, and certain industrial goods were particularly sought after. The stricter Napoleon enforced the ban, the more smuggling grew. Entire coastal regions became spaces for clandestine business. Traders, civil servants, sailors, and local elites found ways to circumvent bans or overlook them in exchange for bribery. The economic war therefore demanded not only decrees, but control, police, coercion, and constant surveillance. For France and its allies, the Continental Blockade had contradictory consequences. Some French industries benefited from the exclusion of British competition. In certain areas, domestic production was able to develop because the market was protected. But at the same time, there was a shortage of raw materials, colonial goods became expensive, trading cities suffered, and many people perceived the measures as a burden. Regions that traditionally lived from maritime trade were hit particularly hard. While Napoleon believed that he was weakening Great Britain, he also hit the economy of his own sphere of influence. The attempt to starve England forced the continent into deprivations that became politically dangerous. Great Britain, for its part, reacted with economic and maritime countermeasures. The British fleet controlled sea routes, seized ships, and used its superiority on the world's oceans. British goods did not simply disappear. They found new markets overseas, were resold through neutral dealers, or reached Europe through smuggling. In addition, Britain was financially more resilient than Napoleon had hoped. The British economy suffered from the conflict, but it did not collapse. Instead, a global trade war intensified, in which neutral states also came under pressure. The United States in particular was affected by British and French measures because their merchant ships were caught between the fronts. The Napoleonic economic war was therefore not limited to Europe, but part of a global struggle for trade, naval supremacy, and political power. For Napoleon, the Continental Blockade increasingly became a question of prestige. When he gave in, he seemed weak. If individual states undermined the system, this called into question its authority. That's why he had to react harder and harder. An economic strategy became a political coercive order. Portugal, which had close relations with Great Britain and did not want to submit completely to the system, came under French pressure. This development contributed directly to Napoleon's intervention in the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was also drawn into the crisis. What began as an economic war against England led to military occupations, dynastic interventions, and finally to a protracted war that was to put a heavy strain on Napoleon's forces. The Continental Blockade was thus not only a trade measure, but an engine of further expansion. The Continental Blockade also played a disastrous role in relations with Russia. Russia had economic interests that could not be permanently reconciled with Napoleon's system. Trade with Great Britain was of great importance to Russian landowners, merchants, and the state, especially in the export of raw materials such as grain, timber, and other products. The more Napoleon demanded that Russia exclude British goods, the greater the tensions became. Tsar Alexander I had concluded an alliance with Napoleon after the defeat of Tilsit in 1807, but this alliance was based on mistrust. The Continental Blockade intensified economic and political antagonisms until Russia distanced itself more and more openly from Napoleon's system. Thus, the economic war against England became one of the reasons for the later Russian campaign. Napoleon accompanied his policy with intensive propaganda. He portrayed Britain as a selfish trading power that was driving Europe to war with money, intrigues, and coalitions. In his portrayal, England was not the defender of the balance, but the real arsonist, paying other states to fight against France. There was a core to this view, as Britain did in fact repeatedly fund alliances against Napoleon. But Napoleon's propaganda concealed the fact that his own policies were also putting pressure on Europe. He spoke of liberation and order, while French troops acted as occupiers in many countries. He lamented British trade dominance, but set up a system himself that patronized other states economically. For him, propaganda was not an accessory, but part of the rule. It was supposed to explain, justify, and control the interpretation of events. In France itself, Napoleon's image as a tireless defender of the nation was cultivated. Newspapers, official reports, works of art, and public celebrations showed him as a ruler who not only won battles, but defended Europe against the power of English gold. The language of economic warfare was morally charged. Great Britain appeared as a merchant state without honor, France as the bearer of order, law, and continental greatness. Such contrasts were deliberately exaggerated. They helped to justify sacrifices and prepare the population for a long conflict. But the longer the Continental Blockade lasted, the more difficult it became to cover up its hardships with big words alone. The economic war showed a central weakness of Napoleon's power. On the battlefield, he could force opponents to make up their minds within hours or days. But economies are not so easy to command. Trade finds ways, needs do not disappear by decree, and markets often react differently to pressure than armies. Napoleon also often thought like a general in business. He wanted to block, cut off, force, concentrate, and break. But economic systems were less obedient than troops. They consisted of countless decisions made by individual traders, buyers, officials, and smugglers. The more Napoleon tried to order this world with orders, the more clearly the limits of his authoritarian thinking became apparent. At the same time, the Continental Blockade must not be dismissed as mere folly. It was a serious response to a real strategic problem. Great Britain was hardly militarily accessible to Napoleon and financed more and more new opponents. An indirect attack on the British economy was therefore understandable from his point of view. The problem lay less in the basic idea than in the overstretching of its implementation. To effectively isolate Britain, Napoleon had to control all of Europe. But it was precisely this claim to control that generated resistance, smuggling, wars of occupation, and diplomatic tensions. The Continental Blockade was thus an example of how Napoleon's strength could turn into its opposite. His will to find a comprehensive solution led him to a system that required more and more coercion. In the end, the Continental Blockade became a symbol of Napoleonic overstretching. It was intended to weaken Britain, but it tied France to an endless conflict. It was supposed to bring Europe's economy under French leadership, but it made many countries dissatisfied. It was supposed to secure Napoleon's power, but it forced him to intervene more and more deeply in the affairs of other states. It showed his greatness as a strategic thinker, but also his blindness to the limits of control. Britain remained undefeated, smuggling flourished, European allies grumbled, and political crises arose from economic pressure. Napoleon had tried to strangle his unreachable enemy by means of a network of prohibitions. But in the end, this network also contracted around his own empire. Chapter 11. Europe under French domination, allies, vassals, and opponents. After the great victories of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just at the head of France, but at the center of a new European order. His influence extended far beyond the borders of the empire. States were reshaped, princes overthrown, new kings installed, borders shifted, and old political structures eliminated. What had begun in 1789 as a revolution against privileges, the rule of the estates and absolutist power, had become an imperial system under Napoleon that touched almost the entire continent. France was not simply one great power among several, but the determining factor of Europe. But this dominance was contradictory. It brought reforms, modern administration, and legal innovations, but also occupation, taxes, forced recruitment, and the loss of political independence. Napoleon's power was particularly evident in Germany. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which had formed a loose, complicated, and often cumbersome order for centuries, ended in 1806. Emperor Franz II laid down the Roman-German imperial crown after Napoleon had created the Confederation of the Rhine. This confederation of German states was under French protection, but in reality it was heavily dependent on Napoleon. For many smaller and medium-sized German princes, the connection with France was initially attractive. They received territorial gains, rank upgrades, and protection from stronger neighbors. Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden benefited in particular. But the price was high. The states of the Confederation of the Rhine had to provide troops, support French interests, and align their foreign policy with Napoleon's will. Allies became vassals, even if they retained their own farms and titles. Napoleon knew how to exploit old antagonisms. Many German princes feared Austria or Prussia more than France, and saw in Napoleon a guarantor of their new position. At the same time, French domination actually brought modernization. In many areas, administration, jurisdiction, taxation, and the military were reformed. Old feudal structures were weakened or eliminated, ecclesiastical rulers had already been secularized, and the idea of a rationally organized state gained in importance. The influence of the Code Civil spread ideas of legal equality, protection of property, and state order. For bourgeois elites, this could mean progress. But these reforms did not come from free internal development, but often under pressure from a foreign power. Precisely for this reason, their effect remained ambivalent. What appeared to be modernization could also be perceived as humiliation. The situation was similar in Italy. Napoleon had already created political reorganizations there as a young general, and as emperor he further expanded this influence. He made himself king of Italy and placed members of his family or close confidants in important positions. Northern Italy was closely tied to France, while other territories came directly or indirectly under Napoleonic control. Here, too, reforms were introduced, administration streamlined, old privileges eliminated, and modern state structures established. But many Italians experienced French rule not only as liberation from old princes, but as new foreign rule. Taxes, military service, economic burdens, and political paternalism created discontent. At the same time, the French order also awakened national ideas in the long term. By politically restructuring Italy, creating administrative spaces, and questioning old small states, Napoleon inadvertently contributed to the fact that the desire for Italian unity could later become stronger. A central means of Napoleonic rule was the family. Napoleon trusted dynastic ties because he believed that relatives would be more loyal to him than foreign princes. He placed his brothers and relatives on European thrones. Joseph Bonaparte first became King of Naples and later King of Spain. Louis Bonaparte became King of Holland, Jerome Bonaparte King of Westphalia. Caroline Bonaparte and her husband Joachim Murat played an important role in Naples. This policy was intended to create a network of loyal lords who served France's interests and stabilized Napoleon's system. But it also showed his growing tendency to treat Europe as a personal power landscape. Countries were no longer seen as independent political communities, but as fields that could be ordered according to strategic utility. Especially with his relatives, however, it became clear that loyalty was not a matter of course. Louis Bonaparte, for example, as King of Holland, tried to take the interests of his Dutch subjects into account more than Napoleon wanted. For Napoleon, this was a betrayal of the imperial order as a whole. Holland was to be part of the Continental Blockade and serve French interests. When Louis became too independent, Napoleon lost confidence in him. This shows how narrow the boundaries of Napoleonic autonomy were. Even kings who owed their crowns to Napoleon were only allowed to act independently, as long as they did not hinder the will of the emperor. Napoleonic Europe was therefore not a true community of allied states, but a graduated order of direct rule, dependent kingdoms, forced alliances, and monitored satellites. Prussia experienced Napoleon's power particularly traumatically. After the crushing defeat at Jena and Austerlitz in 1806, the old Prussian military power collapsed frighteningly quickly. Berlin was occupied, and the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 forced Prussia to suffer heavy territorial losses, high payments, and political humiliation. But it was precisely this catastrophe that triggered far-reaching reforms in Prussia. Men like Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau realized that the old state could not survive if it did not renew itself. Administrative reforms, peasant liberation, army reform, and educational reforms were also understood as a response to Napoleon's superiority. Napoleon thus became both an opponent and an involuntary teacher. His victories forced defeated states to ask themselves why France had become so strong and what reforms were necessary to survive in the future. Russia occupied a special position in this system. After the Battle of Friedland and the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, a kind of partnership seemed to have developed between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I. Both rulers met on a raft on the Niemen, a symbolic image of two emperors who could reorder Europe among themselves. Napoleon hoped to integrate Russia into his system and further isolate Britain through the Continental Blockade. Alexander, on the other hand, sought time, leeway, and advantages for Russian interests, especially in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. But the alliance was full of mistrust from the beginning. Napoleon and Alexander admired each other in a way, but neither wanted to be the other's junior partner permanently. Their interests soon clashed, especially in Poland, in trade, and in the question of how far French influence in Central Europe could reach. Poland was a particularly sensitive point. Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw from territories that Prussia had lost. For many Poles, whose state had been divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the late 18th century, this raised hopes of national rebirth. Polish soldiers served Napoleon with great loyalty because they saw in him the man who might one day be able to restore Poland. But Napoleon used this hope cautiously and calculatingly. He did not want to provoke Russia too early and avoided openly creating a complete Polish kingdom. For the Poles, he therefore remained a beacon of hope and a power politician at the same time. For Russia, however, the Duchy of Warsaw was already a warning signal. It was a reminder that Napoleon's reorganization of Europe could affect Russian security interests. Meanwhile, Great Britain remained the irreconcilable opponent. It was not part of Napoleon's continental system and was not militarily occupied, but operated from a distance. With its fleet, it controlled the seas, supported resistance, financed coalitions, and kept global trade largely open. Napoleon was able to defeat almost all continental opponents at times, but he could not force Great Britain to make peace. As a result, his European system remained incomplete. As long as England held out, There was always a power that could encourage opponents, support insurgencies, and fund new alliances. Napoleon's supremacy was therefore enormous, but never certain. It was almost overwhelming on land, but limited at sea. In the occupied and dependent territories, resistance grew over time. Initially, many people had looked at the French armies with hope or at least curiosity. The ideals of 1789, the abolition of feudal privileges and the prospect of legal reforms had an attractive effect. But the longer the French rule lasted, the more its burdens became apparent. Soldiers were drafted, taxes were levied, goods were confiscated, local interests were disregarded, and political decisions were determined from outside. Especially the constant wars demanded people and money. Families saw their sons disappear into armies fighting in Spain, Germany, Poland, or later Russia. For many, liberation turned into submission. Admiration turned into exhaustion, and the willingness to reform grew into national defiance. Napoleon often underestimated the power of such feelings. He thought in terms of states, armies, dynasties, and administrative structures. He could defeat princes, replace ministers, and redraw borders. But the loyalty of populations could not be generated by decrees alone. In many parts of Europe, a new awareness of national independence emerged under French pressure. German patriots, Spanish resistance fighters, Italian reformers, and Polish hopes developed in very different directions, but they were all influenced by Napoleon's rule. His empire spread modern ideas, but at the same time it evoked counter-movements. It destroyed old structures, but it created new longings for self-determination. French domination of Europe was therefore never just a military system. It was a laboratory of modernity and an empire of coercion at the same time. Napoleon brought laws, administration, career principles, and the idea of state efficiency to many regions. But he demanded obedience, tribute, soldiers, and obedience. He installed kings, but he did not tolerate real independence. He spoke of order, but his order had to be constantly defended by war. He wanted to stabilize Europe, but his interventions made new conflicts inevitable. The larger his system became, the harder it became to keep it together. Each new vassal, each dependent throne, each occupied region, and each forced reform increased not only his power, but also the number of people waiting for an opportunity to free themselves from it. At the beginning of the Napoleonic Empire, there was the fascination of a man who seemed to be able to break down old boundaries. At the end of this phase, however, it became clear that Europe was too diverse, too resistant, and too complex in terms of power politics to be permanently ordered according to the will of a single emperor. Napoleon had forced the continent into a system based on his authority. As long as his armies were victorious, this system had an unshakable effect. But beneath the surface, discontent, national hopes, economic strains, and diplomatic tensions accumulated. Europe was under French domination, but it was not pacified. It was just waiting for the moment when Napoleon's power would visibly falter for the first time. Chapter 12. The War in Spain, the beginning of the end. The war in Spain became a turning point for Napoleon Bonaparte, which did not immediately destroy his power, but slowly and inexorably undermined its foundation. At first glance, the Iberian Peninsula seemed to be just another space that Napoleon wanted to arrange according to his will. France had already defeated large parts of Europe, made princes dependent, created new kingdoms, and enforced the Continental Blockade against Great Britain. In comparison, Spain seemed like a weak, internally torn state, whose ruling house had little authority and whose policies had long been overshadowed by French interests. But precisely where Napoleon believed that he could quickly create order with dynastic manipulation and military superiority, he encountered a form of resistance that could not be broken by a single decisive battle. For him, Spain became not simply a theater of war, but an open wound of his empire. The background to this conflict was closely related to the Continental Blockade against Great Britain. Portugal, traditionally closely linked to England, was a problem for Napoleon because British goods could continue to gain access to the European continent via Portuguese ports. If the economic war against England was to work, Portugal had to be forced to submit to the French system. To reach Portugal, French troops needed to march through Spain. The Spanish monarchy under Charles IV and his influential favorite Manuel de Godoy was politically weak, internally unpopular and dependent on French pressure. At first, it seemed easy for Napoleon to use Spain as a transit area and ally. But the presence of French troops on Spanish soil fundamentally changed the situation. What began as a military march soon became an occupation. Spain was already in a deep crisis before Napoleon's intervention. The court was marked by intrigue, trust in Charles IV was low, and the heir to the throne, Ferdinand, opposed Godoy's influence. Many Spaniards were dissatisfied with the government, but this dissatisfaction did not mean that they wanted to accept French foreign rule. Napoleon believed that he could exploit the weakness of the Spanish royal family. In Bayonne in 1808, he forced both Charles IV and Ferdinand VII to renounce the crown and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. From his point of view, this was a sensible reorganization. Joseph was to modernize Spain, serve French interests, and integrate the Iberian Peninsula into the Napoleonic system. But Napoleon completely underestimated the symbolic significance of the legitimate monarchy and the Catholic faith for large parts of the Spanish population. The installation of Joseph was perceived by many Spaniards not as a reform, but as a humiliation. A foreign emperor had disposed of their dynasty, removed their king, and placed a Bonaparte on the throne for them. Even people who had been dissatisfied with the old government saw it as an attack on the national and religious order. The uprising of May 2, 1808 in Madrid became a beacon. French troops brutally crushed the resistance, shootings followed, and the violence of those days burned itself deeply into the Spanish memory. Napoleonic power no longer appeared as the bearer of law and progress, but as an occupying power that ruled with bayonets and executions. This gave the war a new quality. It was not only a conflict between armies, but a struggle of a population against a rule that was perceived as alien and godless. For Napoleon, this kind of war was particularly dangerous because it ran counter to his usual strengths. His military art was based on maneuvering enemy main armies, defeating them in decisive battles, and then forcing political results through peace treaties. In Spain, however, there was not only one opposing army whose defeat would have ended the war. There were local uprisings, guerrilla groups, clergy, peasants, city militias, nobles, officers, and regional junta governments that organized resistance in the name of Ferdinand VII. Even when French troops captured a city or defeated a Spanish army, resistance flared up again elsewhere. The landscape, the poor infrastructure, the mountains, the long supply routes, and the hostility of many inhabitants made any French movement dangerous. The war became tough, cruel, and confusing. The term guerrilla gained special significance in this war. Small groups attacked supply columns, killed messengers, raided isolated units, destroyed connections, and disappeared back into the population or the terrain. Such attacks could not destroy a large army in open battle, but they could exhaust it, unsettle it, and bind it. French soldiers had to secure roads, guard depots, control cities, and constantly expect ambushes. The occupation often reacted with harsh retaliation, which in turn increased the hatred of the population. This created a cycle of resistance, repression, and even stronger resistance. Napoleonic order turned into a war of occupation that turned more and more people against France. Particularly serious was the fact that Britain found a new approach to the war on the continent in Spain and Portugal. After Trafalgar, England was unchallenged at sea, but on land it needed a place where British troops could fight effectively against Napoleon. The Iberian Peninsula offered this opportunity. Portugal remained an important ally and base for Great Britain. Under Arthur Wellesley, the later Duke of Wellington, a persistent British-Portuguese warfare developed there. Wellington avoided unnecessary risks, using fortified lines, supplies by sea, and the difficulty of the French supply routes. While Napoleon was looking for great victories in other theaters, a war arose in Spain and Portugal that deprived France of forces without allowing a quick decision. The defeat of French troops at Bayonne in July 1808 was a severe shock. For the first time, a larger Napoleonic army capitulated in an open field. The psychological effect was enormous. The idea of French invincibility began to crack. In Europe, Napoleon's opponents saw that resistance was possible. For Spain, Bailén became a symbol of national hope. Joseph Bonaparte had to leave Madrid for a time, and Napoleon himself was forced to intervene personally on the Iberian Peninsula. At the end of 1808, he led a large army into Spain, defeated several opponents, and re-entered Madrid. As is so often the case, he showed impressive skills on the battlefield and in rapid advance. But his personal intervention could not solve the basic problem. As soon as he left Spain, the war continued. Joseph Bonaparte was in an almost impossible situation. He was not a completely incompetent man and wanted to carry out reforms. But his rule suffered from the stain of being used by others from the very beginning. For the French military commanders, it was often of limited importance, as they followed the interests of Napoleon and the demands of war rather than the political needs of a Spanish king. For many Spaniards, Joseph was simply the intruder, a symbol of foreign arrogance. His attempts at reform were hardly effective because they were overshadowed by occupation, violence, and war. This revealed a fundamental weakness of Napoleonic satellite rule. An appointed king could promise modern administration, but without real legitimacy he remained dependent on French bayonets. The Spanish War also became a struggle for interpretation and morality. French propaganda portrayed Napoleon as a modernizer who wanted to free a backward Spain from corruption, superstition, and poor administration. In fact, there were enlighteners and reformers in Spain who welcomed certain changes or at least recognized that the country needed renewal. But the French occupation made this question of reform almost insoluble. Those who worked with Joseph were considered traitors by many. Those who fought against France did not always defend liberal values, but often religion, monarchy, and traditional order. War was therefore not simply progress against backwardness or freedom against tyranny. It was a confused conflict in which national self-assertion, religious feelings, social tensions, hopes for reform, and brutal violence intertwined. The cruelty of the war also shaped the European perception of Napoleon. In particular, the paintings and later etchings of Francisco de Goya made the suffering of the civilian population vividly visible. Shootings, mutilations, hunger, fear, and retaliation were part of everyday life in many regions. Both sides committed violence, but the moral damage to French rule was devastating. Napoleon liked to present himself as the heir to the revolution, as a legislator and modernizer. In Spain, many now saw above all the oppressor, whose soldiers combed through villages, shot people, and wanted to rule a country against their will. The splendor of Austerlitz and Jena was obscured by the shadows of Madrid, Zaragoza, and countless smaller locales. For the Napoleonic system, the military costs were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been tied up on the Iberian Peninsula over the years. These troops were missing elsewhere or had to be constantly replaced. Marshals who had been successful on large battlefields were given difficult, often frustrating tasks in Spain. They were able to achieve victories, but they were not able to achieve final peace. The control of large cities did not mean the control of the country. Roads could be safe in the morning and dangerous in the evening. An army could cross an area without actually owning it. This difference between military presence and political domination became increasingly problematic for Napoleon. In the long term, the war in Spain acted as a signal to Europe. He showed that Napoleon's power could be challenged not only by regular armies, but also by national uprising, people's war, and persistent support from outside. Austria, Prussia, and Russia are watching the development closely. The Spanish experience proved that French rule was vulnerable when it met with resistance from a population and when Britain found a firm foothold. The myth of invincibility was not destroyed, but damaged. Napoleon could continue to win great battles, but he could not be everywhere at once. He could not personally put down every uprising, and he could not make every country permanently submissive through fear and administration. The war in Spain was therefore indeed the beginning of the end, even if Napoleon's power still seemed enormous afterwards. He did not immediately lose his empire there, but he lost something perhaps more important: the simple logic of his victories. Until then, he had often believed that political problems could be solved by decisive military strikes. Spain showed him that a defeated state is not the same as a defeated people. A capital could fall, a king could be installed, an army could be defeated, and yet the war could go on. This realization was devastating for an empire based on control, speed, and authority. In the end, Spain became Napoleon's ulcer, as he later felt it himself. It deprived his empire of blood, money, soldiers, and moral credibility. It gave Britain a continental theater of war. It fed national resistance and showed the European powers that French domination was not unshakable. What Napoleon had started as a side operation to enforce the Continental Blockade developed into a war of attrition that lasted for years. In the Spanish mountains, towns, and villages, the aura of the unstoppable emperor began to fade. Napoleon still stood there powerfully. Nor was he to lead Europe into an even greater catastrophe with the Russian campaign. But Spain had shown that its empire was not only fought on the borders. It could also bleed from the inside out if people refused to recognize its order as their own. Chapter 13. The Russian Campaign of 1812, Megalomania, Cold, and Catastrophe. The Russian campaign of 1812 became the greatest catastrophe in Napoleon's rule and the event that finally shattered the myth of his invincibility. Until then, Napoleon had suffered severe setbacks, especially in Spain, but on the great battlefields of Europe he was still regarded as a military genius, a master of movement, a ruler who could lead armies more quickly, deceive opponents more precisely, and resolve political crises through decisive force. Russia challenged this logic in a way that Napoleon underestimated. Here it was not enough to occupy a capital, defeat an army, or force a treaty. Russia was too big, too deep, too resilient, and Tsar Alexander I was not prepared to bow to the French will again permanently. A political conflict became a campaign became a struggle for survival, and Napoleon's largest army became a march of misery. The causes of the conflict lay above all in the fragile alliance between Napoleon and Alexander, which had existed since the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. At that time, both rulers had apparently come to an understanding after Napoleon's victory over Russia and Prussia. Napoleon hoped to integrate Russia into his European system, especially the Continental Blockade against Great Britain. Alexander, in turn, sought time, leeway, and recognition for Russian interests. But the trust between the two was weak. Russia suffered economically from the Continental Blockade because trade with Great Britain was of great importance to Russian nobles, merchants, and the state. Grain, timber, hemp, and other raw materials found important buyers through maritime trade. When Napoleon demanded that Russia exclude British goods and close its ports, he was deeply interfering with economic interests. For Alexander, the French system became more and more of a burden, not a partnership. In addition, there were political and strategic tensions. Napoleon had created an order in Central Europe that worried Russia. The Duchy of Warsaw, in particular, aroused suspicion. For many Poles, Napoleon was a beacon of hope because they saw in him the man who might one day be able to restore an independent Poland. For Russia, this very idea was dangerous, because large parts of the former Poland were under Russian rule. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 also changed the balance. Alexander could see in this a rapprochement between France and Austria, while Russia lost importance. Personal vanity, diplomatic insults, economic interests, and strategic fears were mixed. Both emperors saw themselves as great shapers of Europe, but Europe had no room for two equally strong claims to order. Napoleon finally decided to go to war because he believed that he could force Russia back into his system by a huge military blow. He did not necessarily want to overthrow Alexander, but to make him obey. But even this objective was problematic. Russia was not a smaller state that had to make peace immediately after losing a battle. It had enormous spaces, large reserves of people, and the possibility of avoiding the enemy. Nevertheless, Napoleon prepared an army the likes of which Europe had hardly seen before. The Grande Armée, with which he crossed the Niemen in June 1812, consisted of hundreds of thousands of soldiers from France and many dependent or allied states. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Croats, and many others marched in this huge army. It was a mirror of his empire, but also a sign of his dependence on subjugated and obligated countries. The very beginning of the campaign revealed the difficulties. Such a huge army had to be fed, moved, and cared for. Napoleon had hoped, as in previous campaigns, to force a decision quickly and to supply himself partly from the country. But Russia offered other conditions. The distances were huge, the roads were often poor, the supply lines were getting longer and longer, and the Russian armies were retreating instead of being confronted early in a devastating decisive battle. This retreat tactic was more dangerous for Napoleon than an immediate fight. He needed a battle to break the enemy, but the further he advanced, the more his army suffered from heat, dust, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and supply problems. Even before winter came, people and horses were dying in frightening numbers. The Russian leadership was not free of conflicts. There was a dispute about whether to fight Napoleon early or retreat further. Many officers and nobles found the retreat humiliating. Nevertheless, he worked strategically in favor of Russia. The deeper Napoleon penetrated into the country, the less he was able to develop his usual warfare. His strength lay in clutching opposing armies, separating them, forcing them into concentrated combat, and then bringing about a political decision. Russia evaded this logic. Instead of a clear decision, Napoleon was given space, exhaustion, and uncertainty. At the same time, Russian troops and authorities destroyed supplies or evacuated areas, so that the French army found less than it needed. The famous scorched earth was not complete and systematic everywhere, but it exacerbated the basic problem. The country did not feed the invader sufficiently. In September 1812, the Battle of Borodino finally took place, one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon finally got the great battle he had sought, but it did not bring the clear, crushing victory he needed. The French army attacked heavily fortified Russian positions, including the Revsky Redoubt and the so-called flèches. The fighting was tremendously brutal. Artillery, infantry attacks and counterattacks turned the battlefield into a sea of smoke, blood, and noise. Napoleon won tactically because the Russians eventually withdrew and the way to Moscow was open. But the Russian army was not destroyed. She remained fit to fight, albeit badly battered. Napoleon had lost many men without forcing the political decision. Borodino was a victory that already felt like a warning. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he perhaps expected Tsar Alexander to negotiate. In previous campaigns, the capture of important cities had often generated political pressure. But Moscow was not the capital of the empire in the administrative sense. St. Petersburg had that role. Nevertheless, Moscow was of enormous symbolic importance. When the French reached the city, they found it largely deserted. Shortly afterwards, huge fires broke out, destroying large parts of Moscow. Responsibility and precise procedures are still debated today, but for Napoleon the result was decisive. The city, which was supposed to offer his army accommodation and supplies, became a burning, empty symbol of a victory without benefit. He had reached Moscow, but had not defeated Russia. Napoleon waited in Moscow for peace offers, but Alexander remained firm. This waiting was disastrous. Every day worsened the situation of the Grande Armée. Supplies became scarcer, discipline disintegrated, diseases and insecurity increased. Napoleon was deep inside Russia, with no clear political perspective and an army that was already severely weakened. The decision to withdraw came late. When the Grande Armée left Moscow, it was no longer the brilliant force that had crossed the Niemen in June. It was exhausted, decimated, and burdened by wounded, booty, motorcades, and declining morale. The way back turned into a disaster. Winter exacerbated the suffering, but it was not the only cause of the collapse. Even before that, hunger, disease, desertion, overwhelm, and the loss of horses had weakened the army. But with cold, snow, and ice, the retreat turned into a death march. Soldiers froze to death, collapsed exhausted, lost weapons, shoes, and all order. Horses died en masse, which meant that artillery and wagons had to be abandoned. Cossacks and Russian troops attacked stragglers, cutting off paths and increasing panic. The Grande Army partially dissolved into groups of survivors who were only looking for food, warmth, and protection. Military discipline gave way to bare survival. The crossing over the Berezina in November 1812 was particularly dramatic, when Russian forces tried to cut off Napoleon's retreat. Under chaotic conditions, French engineers managed to build bridges over which parts of the army could escape. The transition was a mixture of organizational achievement and human tragedy. Thousands died, were left behind, drowned, or were taken prisoner. Nevertheless, Napoleon escaped with a remnant of his army. From a military point of view, the Berezina was not a complete Russian success, because Napoleon was not captured. Humanly and symbolically, however, she showed the extent of the disaster. The largest army in Europe had become a shadow. Napoleon eventually left the army and rushed back to Paris to secure his political power. In his view, this decision was necessary, because a ruler who had stayed away for months and whose army had been destroyed had to reckon with unrest, intrigues, and doubts. But for many soldiers it seemed bitter. They had suffered, frozen, starved, and seen comrades die while the emperor returned to the capital. The man who had once bound his army to himself through proximity, fame, and common danger now appeared more distant. The Russian campaign damaged not only his military power, but also the emotional bond between Napoleon and the myth of the Grande Armée. The consequences were enormous. Of the huge force that had moved to Russia, only a small part returned fit for combat. France lost experienced soldiers, officers, horses, material, and above all, the aura of invincibility. Europe's powers recognized that Napoleon was vulnerable. Prussia, Austria, and other states began to re-examine their options. The Russian campaign became a signal that the French emperor was no longer unstoppable. His empire, based on victory, fear, and political dependence, began to falter as soon as victory failed to materialize and fear subsided. The Russian campaign was therefore more than a military failure. It was the result of a dangerous combination of strategic coercion, political ambition, and imperial hubris. Napoleon had a real problem, because Russia evaded its continental system and endangered its European order. But his answer was excessive. He believed that he could transfer the methods of his earlier victories to a space that eluded them. He underestimated distance, climate, supply, Russian determination, and the possibility that an opponent would rather sacrifice space than submit politically. In Russia, Napoleon's will reached limits that could not be overcome by genius. In the end, what remained of 1812 was a picture that was stronger than any victory propaganda: ragged soldiers in the snow, burning cities, dead horses by the wayside, abandoned cannons, endless columns of starving people, and an emperor whose star was beginning to sink. Napoleon had reached Moscow, but his empire had lost security. He had gathered one of the largest armies in history, but had consumed it in the vastness of Russia. The Russian campaign showed that power, if it no longer recognizes borders, can destroy itself. From then on, Napoleon no longer fought to further shape Europe, but increasingly to save what remained of his rule. Chapter 14. Leipzig, Abdication, and Exile on Elba. After the catastrophe of the Russian campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte was faced with a situation that would have been hardly imaginable just a few years earlier. The emperor, who had dominated Europe with his armies, was no longer the undisputed master of decision. His Grande Armée had almost completely perished in Russia. Experienced soldiers, officers, horses, artillery, and supplies were lost, and with them the terror that his name had caused in many opponents disappeared. Although Napoleon still remained an extraordinary organizer and general, his empire was based on a dangerous prerequisite: it had to win. As long as his armies were successful, allies obeyed, opponents hesitated, and many French believed in his historic mission. After 1812, however, this structure began to break apart. States that had previously stood by his side out of fear or calculation were looking for a way out of French domination. Prussia in particular became a center of resistance after the Russian campaign. The defeat of 1806 had deeply humiliated the kingdom, but at the same time awakened forces of reform. Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst and others had tried to renew the state, administration, and military. The memory of Jena and Auerstedt was not forgotten, and many Prussian patriots now saw the opportunity to restore national honor. When General Yorck effectively detached his Prussian troops from French allegiance at the end of 1812 with the Convention of Torringen, this was a political signal of enormous importance. Prussia moved out of its force dependence and moved closer to Russia. In 1813, this development turned into the War of Liberation, supported by military interests, monarchical politics, and a growing national feeling directed against French foreign rule. Napoleon reacted with astonishing energy. Despite the losses in Russia, he managed to raise a new army in a short time. France mobilized young recruits, but they were often poorly trained and inexperienced. Above all, there was a lack of cavalry, because the loss of horses in Russia was difficult to replace. Cavalry was crucial for reconnaissance, pursuit of defeated opponents, and operational mobility. Napoleon could still lead armies, plan battles, and surprise opponents, but his military machine was no longer the same. The splendor of the old Grande Armée could not be easily restored. Nevertheless, in 1813 he once again proved his enormous ability to remain dangerous from a difficult situation. In the spring campaigns of 1813, Napoleon won victories at Lutzen and Botzen. These battles showed that his opponents could not underestimate him. He remained tactically superior, his presence on the battlefield continued to be electrifying, and his opponents struggled to see through his movements. But the victories were not decisive enough. Because he lacked sufficient cavalry, he could not pursue and destroy defeated enemies as he had in earlier years. The opposing armies withdrew, remained capable of fighting, and were able to regroup. This was precisely where the changed situation became apparent. Napoleon could still win, but he could no longer turn his victories into political submission. The war became a struggle of exhaustion, and in such a war the coalition powers had increasing advantages. Austria played a decisive role in this phase. Emperor Franz I, Napoleon's father-in-law, and his foreign minister Metternich wanted to restore the European balance, but they acted cautiously. For a long time, Austria had vacillated between fear of Napoleon and fear of too strong a Russian-Prussian power. Metternich initially tried to act as a mediator. For Napoleon, a compromise might have offered the opportunity to save some of his power. But his thinking was still shaped by the claim not to appear as a defeated ruler. He had difficulty accepting real concessions because his authority was based on strength. Any renunciation could appear as weakness, and weakness was dangerous for his system. Thus, peace opportunities failed, and Austria finally joined the coalition against him. Napoleon thus faced a broad front of Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Great Britain. The coalition powers had learned from previous defeats. They no longer necessarily wanted to attack Napoleon where he personally commanded, but to defeat his marshals, disperse his forces, and use the superiority of their combined armies. The so-called Trachenberg Plan aimed to avoid direct decisions against Napoleon himself and instead to fight his subordinates. This strategy was clever, because Napoleon remained the most dangerous general in Europe. But his system was heavily dependent on his personal leadership. Where he was not present himself, the same determination, overview, and authority were often lacking. Victories of the coalition at Grossbeeren, Katzbach, Dennewitz, and Kulm considerably weakened the French position. The net contracted. The decisive clash came in October 1813 near Leipzig. The Battle of the Nations, as it was later called, was one of the largest battles in European history up to that point. Over several days, hundreds of thousands of soldiers from numerous nations fought against each other. Leipzig became the symbol of an entire continent that rose up against Napoleon's domination. On the French side, in addition to the French, there were also Poles, Italians, Saxons, Württembergers, and other contingents, partly out of loyalty, partly out of compulsion, partly out of dynastic ties. On the other side, Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, and other allies fought. The battle was not only militarily charged, but politically charged. Here it was decided whether Napoleon's rule over Central Europe could still last. Napoleon fought with great determination at Leipzig, but the balance of power worked against him. The coalition had numerical superiority and was always able to bring in new troops. The change of sides of Saxon troops during the battle weighed particularly heavily, making the moral and political disintegration of his alliance system visible. Vassals and allies who had supported Napoleon for years began to understand that his defeat was possible. Anyone who stayed by his side for too long risked going down with him. The battle ended with a French retreat, which became a disaster due to the premature blowing up of a bridge over the Elster. Many soldiers were cut off, killed, or captured. Among the dead was the Polish Prince Józef Poniatowski, one of Napoleon's most loyal allies. Leipzig was the decisive break. After this defeat, the Napoleonic system in Germany quickly disintegrated. The Confederation of the Rhine began to disintegrate, former allies changed sides, and French rule east of the Rhine collapsed. Napoleon retreated to France, but the war was no longer a struggle for supremacy in Europe, but for the survival of his empire. For the first time in many years, an invasion of France itself was imminent. The boundaries that Napoleon had so often crossed were now crossed by his opponents. The war returned to the country from which it had once emerged. The campaign of 1814 in France once again showed Napoleon in one of his most impressive military roles. With much smaller forces, he led a series of swift and skillful operations against the invading coalition armies. In Brienne, Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and other battles, he proved that his tactical genius had not disappeared. He defeated separate enemy corps, used internal lines, and moved with an energy that once again impressed his opponents. But these victories could not turn the strategic situation around. France was exhausted, the population was tired of war, resources were limited, and the coalition had a superior force that could cope with individual setbacks. Napoleon won battles, but he lost the war. In Paris, meanwhile, political support dwindled. Many elites who had served Napoleon for years began to break away from him. They had profited from his rule, received titles, offices, and wealth, but now they feared complete collapse. Talleyrand, the former foreign minister and master of political adjustment, played an important role in preparing for the transition. When the Allies took Paris in March 1814, the decision was practically made. The capital, the political heart of France, was no longer in Napoleon's hands. Without Paris, without the secure support of the Senate, and without sufficient strength to continue fighting, his rule lost its foundation. Napoleon initially wanted to abdicate in favor of his son, the little King of Rome, whom he had with Marie-Louise. In this way, he hoped to preserve the Bonaparte dynasty. But the Allies and many French decision-makers no longer wanted a Napoleonic continuation. Finally, Napoleon had to abdicate on April 6, 1814. This moment was dramatic, but also full of historical irony. The man who had overthrown kings, shifted borders, and treated dynasties according to his will was now himself ousted from power by a coalition of European powers. For years, he had determined who was allowed to rule in Europe. Now others decided on him. The Treaty of Fontainebleau granted Napoleon the island of Elba as a small principality. He was allowed to keep his imperial title, but his power was limited to a small Mediterranean island. For a man who had ruled over large parts of Europe, this was an almost surreal diminution of his fate. Elba was close to Italy, manageable, limited, far from the great capitals of power. But Napoleon also took on this new role with energy. On Elba, he organized administration, road construction, finances, and a small army. Even in exile, he could not simply be idle. He remained a man of order, activity, and self-dramatization. But his fall was not only personal. It marked a major political turning point. The Bourbons returned to France with Louis XVIII, and Europe began to negotiate a new order at the Congress of Vienna. The powers wanted to create a balance that would prevent renewed French domination. At the same time, they wanted to curb revolutionary unrest without being able to completely reverse the changes of the past decades. Napoleon's defeat, therefore, did not simply mean the restoration of the old world. Too much had happened. The civil code, the administrative reforms, the national movements, the experiences of war and mobilization had changed Europe. Even defeated, Napoleon remained a historical force. On Elba, Napoleon was outwardly disempowered, but inwardly not broken. He watched France closely. The return of the Bourbons was disappointing for many French people. Former soldiers felt disregarded, parts of the population feared a return to old privileges, and the new monarchy seemed to many clumsy in dealing with the legacy of the Revolution and the Empire. Napoleon felt that his legend was still alive. He knew that a ruler can retain power not only through armies, but also through memory. Many soldiers continued to see him as their emperor. Many peasants and citizens remembered that he had protected the achievements of the Revolution. Many opponents of the Bourbons could imagine Napoleon rather than a complete return to the old order. So Elba did not become the end of its history, but only a break. Leipzig had broken his dominance in Europe, his abdication had pushed him from the throne, and exile was to render him politically harmless. But Napoleon was no ordinary overthrown ruler. It was a symbol, a reminder of glory, order, war, and advancement. His opponents believed that they had banished him to an island. In truth, they had defeated him, but they had not removed him from people's minds. And as long as his legend lived, the possibility of his return remained. Chapter 15. 100 Days, Waterloo and the Last Exile on St. Helena. When Napoleon Bonaparte lived on Elba, his great political history seemed to be over for most European statesmen. He had been defeated, had abdicated, and had been banished to a small island in the Mediterranean, while in Vienna the victors were negotiating the future of Europe. But Napoleon was no ordinary overthrown ruler. Even without the mighty empire, without Paris, without the Grande Armée, and without the power over the continents, he remained a figure who lived on in the imagination of many people. He was a danger to his opponents as long as he breathed. For his supporters, he was the man who had raised France out of chaos and weakness. For many soldiers, he remained the emperor under whom they had experienced fame, advancement, and an almost mythical community. The Bourbons had regained the throne, but they had not won the hearts of all the French. It was precisely in this gap between political restoration and living memory that Napoleon's last great chance was born. The return of the Bourbons under Louis XVIII was more cautious than some old royalists had hoped, because the king also knew that France could not simply be returned to the time before 1789. Many achievements of the Revolution and the Empire remained, such as the ownership structure, the Code Civil, and part of the modern administration. Nevertheless, dissatisfaction spread. Former officers and soldiers felt neglected, many people distrusted the old nobles returning from exile, and there was concern that the old world could slowly regain influence. For many, the monarchy did not seem like a natural order, but like a foreign body that had been brought back to France by the Allied victors. Napoleon watched all this attentively. He understood that his defeat had been military, but not necessarily definitively political. His name still had power. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon left Elba with a small group of loyalists. It was a tremendously risky step. He had no large army, no secure international support, and no guarantee that France would take him in again. But he relied on something that had carried him many times before: speed, surprise, personal charisma, and the weakness of his opponents. On March 1st, he landed at Golfe Juan on the French Mediterranean coast. From there, the march to the north began, which later became famous as the beginning of the Reign of the 100 Days. The government in Paris declared him a traitor and sent troops to stop him. But it was precisely these troops that became proof of his still tremendous effect. The most famous scene of this return occurred at La Frise. Napoleon confronted the soldiers who were supposed to stop him and is said to have shouted that anyone who wanted to kill his emperor should shoot. Whether every word was uttered in exactly the same way plays less of a role in the historical impact than the fact that the soldiers did not shoot. Instead, many defected to him. This scene shows that Napoleon was more than a former ruler. For many veterans, it was a symbol of their own past, their honor and their social advancement. Under him, men from humble backgrounds had been able to reach officer ranks. Under him, France had challenged Europe. The Bourbons could demand obedience. Napoleon could awaken memories. On his way to Paris, more and more people joined him, and Marshal Ney, who had previously promised to bring Napoleon to Paris in an iron cage, also changed sides. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris. Louis XVIII had fled. Without a major battle, Napoleon had regained the throne. But this return was marked by a deep weakness from the beginning. Napoleon was able to electrify France once again, but he could not reassure Europe. The powers that be at the Congress of Vienna reacted immediately. For them, his return was not an internal French event, but a threat to the entire European order. They declared him a disturber of peace and formed a coalition again. Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were determined not to let him come to power again permanently. Napoleon tried to portray himself as a peace-loving ruler who wanted to accept the borders of France and not wage a new war of conquest. But after 2 decades of war, his opponents no longer believed him. His reputation worked against him. The man who had so often broken treaties, reshaped states, and set armies in motion could not suddenly credibly appear as a guarantor of peace. His situation was also difficult inside. Napoleon knew that he could not simply return to the authoritarian empire of earlier years. France was tired of war, many political groups demanded guarantees, and the experience of its first rule had left its mark. He had a more liberal constitution drafted, the so-called Act Additional, with which he wanted to win political support. But these concessions seemed half-hearted to many. Republicans distrusted him, royalists hated him, moderate citizens feared new wars, and his most loyal supporters expected decisive leadership. Napoleon stood between the past and the present. He had to be emperor-reformer, ruler of peace and warlord at the same time. These roles could hardly be reconciled. As the coalition armies were gathering, Napoleon decided not to wait for an attack in France. He wanted to beat his opponents before they could fully unite their forces. His plan was typically Napoleonic: advance quickly into Belgium, separate the British-Dutch army under the Duke of Wellington from the Prussian army under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, defeat both one after the other, and thus shake the coalition politically. If he succeeded in a brilliant victory, he hoped, the opponents might be able to negotiate or at least hesitate. So Napoleon once again relied on speed, separation of enemy forces, and decisive battles. But the situation was no longer the same as in his great years. His army was brave and partly experienced, but no longer the old Grande Armée. Many officers were killed, exhausted, or politically uncertain. The opponents had learned from previous defeats, and Wellington and Blücher were resolute and experienced commanders. At first, Napoleon's plan seemed to work. At Ligny he defeated the Prussians under Blücher on June 16, 1815. On the same day, French troops fought Wellington's army at Quatre Bras. But the decisive destruction did not succeed. The Prussians were defeated, but not destroyed. They did not retreat to the east, as Napoleon had expected or hoped, but to the north, which allowed them to maintain contact with Wellington. That was a decisive point. Napoleon had won a victory, but had not achieved the strategic separation he needed. Marshal Grouchy was instructed to pursue the Prussians, but the situation remained confusing. It was in these hours that much of what was later to become visible at Waterloo was decided. On June 18, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo took place south of Brussels. The battlefield was soaked by rain, which delayed the start of the French attack and made it difficult for artillery and troops to move. Wellington had positioned his army on a defensive position behind a ridge and used farms such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte as strong bases. His strategy was to hold out until the Prussians could arrive. Napoleon, on the other hand, had to win quickly enough before Blücher's army appeared on the battlefield. The battle became a brutal struggle of attacks, counterattacks, artillery fire, cavalry attacks, and tenacious resistance. The French troops fought with great bravery, but Wellington did not give in. A central problem was that Napoleon had time against him. The attack on Hougoumont tied up French forces without bringing the decisive breakthrough. The battles for La Haye-Sainte became bloody and important, but even there everything took longer than hoped. Marshal Ney led massive cavalry attacks against the British Allied lines, but without sufficient infantry and artillery support, they could not break the enemy squares. Again and again, French horsemen rallied against disciplined infantry formations, while cannons and muskets tore death into the ranks. Napoleon waited for the moment when Wellington would falter. But this moment did not come in time. Then the Prussians appeared on the battlefield. Blücher's troops intervened in the battle at Plancenoit and threatened Napoleon's right flank and his rear. This changed the entire situation. Napoleon had to divert forces to stop the Prussians, while at the same time trying to break Wellington head-on. In the evening, he deployed his last great reserve, the Imperial Guard. For years, these elite units had enjoyed the reputation of being almost unshakable. Their attack was decisive not only militarily, but symbolically. If the Guard broke through, the battle might still be won. If it failed, all was lost. The Guard advanced, came under heavy fire, was stopped and retreated. The cry that the Guard was giving way spread like a shock. The French order collapsed. Retreat turned into flight. Waterloo was not one of the largest battles in terms of the number of participants compared to Leipzig, but its political significance was enormous. It ended Napoleon's last hope. After the defeat, he returned to Paris, but this time he could not save the situation. Political support quickly disintegrated. Many deputies and decision-makers did not want another fight, a siege of Paris and a continuation of a rule that reunited Europe against France. Napoleon abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815, again in favor of his son, but this time too this claim had no political future. The Bourbons returned a second time. The reign of the 100 Days was over. Napoleon initially tried to escape to America, but the British naval blockade made this impossible. Eventually, he surrendered to the British, presumably in the hope of being treated honorably as a former ruler. But the British government and its allies did not want to risk a second Elba case. This time, Napoleon was not to live within reach of Europe. He was taken to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena, far away from France, Europe, and the theaters of his power. There the last chapter of his life began, no longer as a ruler of armies, but as a prisoner of memory. For Napoleon, St. Helena was a bitter diminution of the world. The island was remote, windy, humid, and strictly guarded. The man who had once ruled empires, kingdoms, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers now lived under supervision at Longwood House. His health deteriorated, his relationship with British Governor Hudson Lowe was strained, and his everyday life was marked by ailments, conversations, walks, memories, and working on his own legend. For Napoleon was no longer fighting for battles, but for the interpretation of his life. In conversations with his companions, he presented himself as a victim of the old monarchies, as the guardian of the revolution, as a legislator, as a man of progress who had been misunderstood and betrayed by his enemies. This self-portrayal was not simply a lie, but it was not pure truth either. It was Napoleon's last great campaign, the struggle for history. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died on St. Helena. His body was defeated, his empire disappeared, his dynasty politically failed. But its effect did not end. In France and Europe, his name remained alive. Some saw him as the tyrant who had covered the continent with war. Others revered him as a genius, modernizer, and heir to the revolution. Still others saw in him one of the great contradictory figures of modernity, a man who spread equality before the law and at the same time stifled political freedom, who made careers possible according to merit and at the same time created a new aristocracy, who overthrew old empires and built an empire himself, who modernized and devastated Europe. Waterloo was the end of his power, but not the end of his importance. Napoleon had forced Europe to reorganize itself. His victories had ended the Holy Roman Empire, initiated reforms in Prussia, influenced national movements, spread modern administration, and changed the relationship between war, state, and society. At the same time, his wars had brought immeasurable suffering. Millions of people were affected by his campaigns, as soldiers, civilians, taxpayers, refugees, widows, and orphans. The price of its size was enormous. This is precisely why the question of Napoleon remains so difficult to answer. Was he liberator or oppressor, genius or power seeker, modernizer or warmonger? Perhaps its historical significance lies precisely in the fact that it was all of these things at the same time. His life began in Corsica, on the edge of the great powers, and ended in St. Helena, far out in the Atlantic. In between was a path that changed the world. Napoleon rose because the revolution broke the old order. He ruled because he promised order. He fell because his will to control became greater than the possibilities of his empire. In the end, what remained of him was not only the memory of battles, crowns, and exile, but also the warning that extraordinary talent can become a force that shakes entire continents without measure. Napoleon wanted to dominate history. But in the end, he himself became one of her biggest puzzles.